If you drop out, I don't know what to do. I probably go to the break.
No, it's a new computer. Brand new computer. No issues. Yeah. I just got it yesterday.
Here we go.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America on this exploited and small or ever increasingly small globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, and the only corner that is going to be represented today, I am the indefatigable, the ever vigilant, the last antibody to a seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. Our indispensable co-host, Shane Stranahan, is with his bro this weekend, and so it is just going to be us for today. So welcome to Fault Lines. A little bit strange this morning, only because we're basically splitting this up. I'm going to be running the show today. We're going to have a full show today, and it should be a very good one. In the beginning, we're going to have Elizondo. We're going to have Margaret Kimberly come on. We're going to have Ian Goodrum. We are also going to have Camila Escalante giving us an update from Bolivia. So a very good and packed show today, despite the fact that Shane is not here. We miss him, but I hope he has a great time with his bro. So let's get to the headlines. In the news. In COVID news, the New York Times is reporting at least 955 new coronavirus deaths and 77,718 new cases were reported in the United States on April 1st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 65,574 cases per day, an increase of 20% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, more than 30,562,800 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus. And we, at this point, are up to 555,000 or more than 55,000 deaths. Those numbers are shocking. And every time I read this, I swear, it is a shocking number. Also notice the increase of 20% over the average 2 weeks earlier. We are going up. Now, you heard various members from either the CDC, and you even heard Biden telling people about the mask and everything else. I mean, the concern is obvious. They don't necessarily want, a third or fourth wave. I'm not even sure which wave it is. And we are, if we did have a fourth wave, we'll be in a worst case scenario. I mean, think about it for the moment. The vaccines are going out. Why should this number be going up if the vaccines are going out? And the hope is that there's an inflection point where the number of vaccines and the number of people who are vaccinated level out the number of people who are getting ill. That presents its own bit of weirdness. But all things being equal, the vaccination process in the United States has actually been going well, despite the fact that the number is going up. And if you're looking at countries like Europe, those countries are a basket case in regarding the vaccine. One thing that the U.S. could do, and I agree with Hillary Clinton on this, and I don't think I've ever said those words, vaccine diplomacy. We should be putting out the vaccine. We should be giving that vaccine to other countries that need it. And the point where we have excess, we should be able to use that excess, especially if we're saying 90% of the American public is going to be near a vaccination site. We have X amount of reserve of the vaccine. And I get the political difficulty of giving the vaccine away without having all of your population vaccinated. By the same token, other countries do need it. And if we're going to be in this quote-unquote competition with Russia and China, well, they are ensuring that their excess doses go out to other countries that need it. We should be doing the same. Clinton, even though the reason she's doing it is for entirely geopolitical reasons, on this, she's right. Per Washington Post, British, Swedish Pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca faces fresh challenges to its coronavirus vaccine as Britain's medicine regulator said Thursday that it found 30 cases of a rare blood clot events following the shot's use. And Australia announced that it was investigating a possible link between the vaccine and clotting in a man who was recently immunized. That's unquote. The European Union's drug regulator and World Health Organization have both vouched for the safety of the vaccine, jointly produced by Oxford University and AstraZeneca. In recent weeks, amid growing concerns that it may have caused perhaps dozens of rare blood clot disorders in Europe out of tens of millions of administered doses. That was basically from the Washington Post. And, the wild part about this is the moment that you come out and say that there's a problem with the vaccine, nobody's going to use that vaccine, or it's going to create a headwind on people using that particular vaccine. You must understand the mRNA vaccine was already somewhat new. And if you think to the United States for the moment, and if you think of the way that they went about selling it, the jab, we're going to give the jab. And not just the jab. You also had this notion of all of these celebrities coming out, basically trying to sell the vaccine. They started off with this idea that they wanted to ensure that people knew it was safe. And as such, get a bunch of celebrities, get a bunch of politicians, and all of those guys going out there getting this jab in front of the American public. That was the way they went about selling it. They wanted to say, hey, look at all of these people getting it. It's safe, it's effective, etc. Not to mention, you want to get rid of your mask. You want to go out to restaurants. You want to do X and Y. Get the jab. Get the vaccine. That was the selling point. That was the way they were thinking about it. But imagine for the moment, if within, let's say, I don't know, a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks out of putting out the vaccine, you had a few problems with it. One, the information associated with it wasn't necessarily right, so regulators in the United States had to basically pull the card of AstraZeneca, making the point that the data that you're showing us is old, it doesn't necessarily apply. So there was that. But more importantly, and I think more damaging, is for the companies to say, hey, or one of the countries, hey, there's a blood clot that we're noticing, so we're going to put this on pause. What will happen after that is a large number of people would say, I'm not taking that vaccine because I don't know. And if there's even a hint of a blood clotting disorder, that individual is going to have serious qualms with taking that vaccine, whether it is safe or not. I mean, the moment that you do something like that, it's going to have consequences. I mean, don't get me wrong, though. They're doing their jobs. I mean, the regulators are supposed to do exactly what the regulators did. But the catch is you have 30 cases out of several million. And in the United States, 550,000 people are dead at this point. But look, if there's a clotting disorder with the drug, you need to figure it out. And fact of the matter is the body is extremely complex. And introducing something into that body could have very weird and strange consequences, especially for something that is new technology like the mRNA. Florida Republican Representative Matt Gaetz is being investigated by the Justice Department over sex trafficking allegations. Gaetz has denied the allegations, saying, quote, no part of the allegations against me are true, unquote. On Tuesday, Gaetz claimed that he was the victim of an extortion plot, which the FBI is investigating separately. Multiple sources have confirmed to CNN that Gaetz made a name for himself in Congress by bragging about his sexual escapades with women to his colleagues. People with knowledge of Gaetz' actions, including 2 people directly shown the material, said Gaetz displayed images of women on his phone and talked about having sex with them, including while on the House floor. Being at work didn't stop him from doing it. According to one source, one of Gaetz' videos showed a video of an unfortunate naked woman with a hula hoop. A source noted it was a point of pride for Gaetz. Gaetz is a guy. And I don't mean that as an excuse. I just mean it as it is what it is. Frank Sinatra had a song, wives should always be lovers too, run to his arms the moment that he comes home to you. Yes, greatly misogynistic. But the point was that men have a way about them. Now, the wild part about this is he's doing this in Congress, and he's doing this on the House floor. And Republicans who are supposed to be prude and prudish and conservative, who else was he showing these pictures to if it wasn't part of his ilk? Yeah, this is very strange. He's saying he's been extorted. I suppose the investigation will find out one way or the other. But that is a wild and weird case. The fourth day, a former Minneapolis police, and the thing I said by him being a guy, all I mean by that is, you have an American society where men who grow up in that society have certain expectations placed upon them. They're supposed to be strong. They're not supposed to cry. All of these things are implicit, and yet all of those things are there. Strength, but part of that is sexual vigor. And what I mean by that is this notion of the person being somewhat assertive, of pursuing. I mean, look at the movies that we watch. From the time you were a child to the time that you're drop dead, you see the guy pursuing the female, and this happens over and over and over again. And she tells him no 1,000 times, he keeps it up, and he eventually gets the woman. He's being proactive in doing so. Those are certain things that are expectations. Taking care of your kids, those are expectations. But also, this aspect of virility that Gates is basically showing off by showing the other men. This is something that our society kind of expects on some level. Think of the dad where his kid gets caught. There's a female in the house. The dad catches the kid. The dad is like, "How dare you? You better not bring any baby into this house." And then he's walking away. He's like, "That's my boy." It's that. Gates is just exemplifying that. This is not necessarily defense, because the defense doesn't necessarily need to be made for it. It's just kind of, again, it is what it is. You want Gates to act differently? Change society in regards to the way men are oriented. The fourth day of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial resumed, hearing testimonies on Thursday, including an emotional account from Courtney Ross, Floyd's girlfriend, on the couple's past struggles with drug addiction. Chauvin's former supervisor testified that he should have stopped using force after Floyd was handcuffed on the ground, and Minneapolis paramedic Derek Smith testified that when he arrived at the scene, Floyd already appeared to be dead. And that's the key point, right? Nobody has taken issue with the cops being called. If you want to call the cops, fair enough. Nobody's taken issue with getting the situation under control. Meaning, if you need to put your hands on a suspect because the suspect is being unruly, okay, fair enough. I would prefer de-escalation maneuvers, but if you got to do it, fair enough. But at the point where you subdue the individual, stop. You don't need maximum justice when the individual is already on the ground and the individual is already caught. And when the individual is saying, "I can't breathe," and you clearly are on his throat for X number of minutes, yeah, you're guilty. You're guilty of sin. Your job was supposed to be to protect and serve, including the person that you're trying to bring in. But for whatever particular reason, that guy wasn't worthy of life. On Wednesday evening, one person was injured and 4 were killed, including a 9-year-old boy, in a mass shooting at an Orange office complex. Authorities said the shooting took place inside a real estate and manufactured home business, Unified Homes, and the gunman and victims were connected through personal and business ties. Officers fired through the locked gate, wounding the gunman. 2 officers fired their weapons. Both were wearing body cameras. Few details were immediately available about the motive for the shooting or details about the victims. We keep having these guys. At some point, we're going to have to reconcile why. And you can't just say everybody's a lunatic. And you can't say everybody is just, drinking lead water. There's something that is driving that. 5% of the world's population, 25% of the world's population's prison population in our jails. Something is wrong. After failing to define Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, top Republican aides are telling Axios they learned their lesson. Their game plan this time around is to try to convince voters that the infrastructure legislation is more of a wish list for progressives than a roads and bridges measure. Axios is reporting that a new memo from House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says, quote, Biden's so-called infrastructure plan spends less than 6% to repair bridges, highways, and roads. The rest is a kitchen sink of wasteful progressive demands, unquote. Axios is reporting that several Republican offices have also been circulating a Wall Street Journal editorial highlighting this passage. Quote, First came 1.9 trillion in social spending under the cover of a COVID-19, and now comes 2.3 trillion more for climate and political spending dressed as infrastructure, unquote. Mr. Biden has proven to be the perfect political front for Warren Sanders' agenda. Good luck on that. Good luck on that. If you're going to take aim at the infrastructure package that the American public considers to be very popular, just like the 1.9 trillion stimulus was very popular, good luck on that. This is why you lose. Republicans never learned. You guys were pushing this. Good luck on this. I don't think you're necessarily going to make ends on this. This is no different than Democrats negotiated with themselves on a 1.9 trillion, and these guys are talking about Dr. Seuss. You missed the boat. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. At the very least, usually joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, but my indomitable co-host is with his bro today, and I wish him well. He will be back on Monday. But let's continue. If you guys want to join in on the show, you can do so with a phone call, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us at 202-521-1320. If you guys are in the Washington, D.C. area, you can listen to the show at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. You guys help make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. Feel free to call in or send that chat or tweet. I want to go back to the last headline that I read. And this right here. After failing to define Biden's $1.9 trillion relief package, top Republican aides are telling Axios they learned their lesson. Have you now? What's that lesson that you've learned? Their game plan this time around is to try to convince voters that the infrastructure legislation is more of a wish list for progressives than a roads and bridges measure. So you mean trying to come up with your own policy, trying to set your own policy agenda and showing the American public this is what we believe is the right thing to do. This is what we want to push for. This is how we plan on getting America and this country back on the right footing. 550,000 people, give or take, have dropped dead. They've gone up in flames for all intents and purposes. This wasn't an alien attack. This wasn't a foreign enemy dropping a weapon or dropping a bomb. This wasn't some kind of chemical that was spread through the population that decimated the population. 1 year failure. And that failure wasn't from the American public itself. That's the wild part. Dr. Birx, who has a certain degree of responsibility associated with this, even though she's trying to push that responsibility off, makes the point that the first 100,000, fair game. The deaths after that, not so much. It was failure. And think about that for the moment. If the failure belonged to the government, meaning under Trump, the government didn't take due diligence to ensure that people had the supplies that were necessary, the masks that were necessary, the ventilators that were necessary, the medical equipment that was necessary in all of the hospitals to deal with this particular crisis as it took hold. The policy agenda wasn't necessarily in place to ensure that people were wearing the masks in the appropriate way, that people were, say, made whole while they were staying at home. Because keep in mind, if there's a mask mandate, fair enough, but if the individual needs cash, then that individual is going to gesticulate to get back to work. all of those people who were pushing hard to get back to work, some of them were bothered because they were at home and they didn't necessarily want to be at home, and you might have been a bit blue. But many of those people needed a wage. They needed a paycheck. And the idea that you're going to give, $1,600, how much ever Trump gave, and then let it ride? How do you let that ride? How long do you believe $1,600 or whatever the amount was is going to last? Do you think it pays rent? It doesn't even cover my rent. And I know that covers that same thing applies to many other people. If that is true, the individual is going to push hard to get back to work, even if getting back to work is against his own personal health and safety. Doesn't matter. He needs cash to pay his rent. He needs cash to pay for his kid. He needs cash to pay for his car note. And the moment that you need cash to pay for all of these things and to cover your expenses, even if it means putting your own life at risk because of an illness, you will do so. The administration and the government took a tact and took a policy that cared more about the economy as opposed to human beings, and end up losing both the economy and those human beings. If Donald Trump would have paid more attention to the human being element, he may actually still be president today, and the death toll would be far less, and the economy would be back up and running faster than what eventually took place. If you're going to look at all of that, and you're going to come to the conclusion that the problem is that Democrats are spending too much money, the problem is that they're spending money on all of these other items, on climate change, on whatever else, then I think you're the problem. And you didn't learn anything. Or at the very least, you learned the wrong lesson. The American public is not going to be against this. In fact, I would make the argument that this is too diminutive, considering what happened. All of the wars that we've been involved in this country don't equal up, meaning the number of people that died in all of those wars don't equal up to the number of people that died in this 1 year. And for whatever reason, it seems that politicians are acting as if this is business as usual. It is not business as usual. 30 million people infected, 500,000 dead. And that doesn't even take into account the number of people who have additional issues that basically extend beyond the life of the disease. Who's paying for those medical bills? Who's going to cover the hospitalization costs when most people in the country don't even have $600 in the bank? Who is going to cover those costs? You've basically left all of those people stuck with the burden of something that they didn't ultimately cause. If the Republican Party, what they learned here is that we are going to castigate this plan as just being a wish list, you will lose this debate. The first time around when you were arguing about Dr. Seuss and Democrats were basically negotiating with themselves, negotiating themselves down, no less. The public backed them on that because you were being ridiculous. This is going to turn out to be the exact same way. I don't understand why you all hate the American population so much. What is it that you despise about the American worker, or for that matter, the Americans, that you are so willing to just forego any ethical and philosophical responsibility of your job in Congress, and instead of doing that job, you want to stop them from doing it. You want to inhibit. You want to obstruct. And by the way, it's not even that Biden is doing a huge amount. You guys are obstructing the little amount that he is doing. Why didn't you bring up that Biden dropped the $15 an hour minimum wage? The fact that you were against it doesn't matter. You still should have brought it up. You could have said, hey, I am for, $10 an hour. You're probably not for that, but it doesn't really matter. Hypocrisy is not something that stops politicians from saying anything. But I am for $10, but I am not the one who said $15 an hour. Joe Biden said $15 an hour. Am I right, honorable gentlemen? I worked with Joe Biden for God knows how long. He's a great man. But Joe Biden let the population down when he told them he was going to do 15. It was a bait and switch. You could make that argument. You don't make that argument. You keep making stupid arguments like this. And again, I don't mean to try to help Republicans craft arguments or at the very least try to handle the administration. But you fail so miserably And your failure is Americans' failure. Understand what I mean? If there is one political party that is pushing a COVID plan, yes, I don't think it's big enough, but pushing a COVID plan nonetheless. And the other political party is standing with its thumb firmly in its buttocks, then you really only have one party pushing anything. Same thing's true with the infrastructure plan and whatever other plan Joe Biden comes up with. What you're going to have is Joe Biden dominate. You're going to have Democrats dominate. And you're going to be shocked when they do. And it's not even because they did anything major. This is just basic stuff. Hey, a lot of people died. We need to give something back to the public to try to smooth that over. We don't necessarily want the public to get up in arms and, raid the Capitol or, burn down police stations. Yeah, you need to do something about that. But from the standpoint of the Republican Party, they are so in this camp of the 1%. They're so in this camp of scorched earth. I don't know what it is at this point. I mean, they're off the reservation in regards to a political party. It doesn't even seem like a political party in the context of policy that represent the interests of the public in any particular real way. They're not representing anybody but themselves and a very tiny, tiny body of human beings. And the wild part is it's not so much that the Democratic Party is representing anybody else all that much either. But they at the very least have sense enough to push through something to try to maintain their station. Whereas the Republican Party, I have no idea what they're doing. Democrats are pushing a diminutive plan. Republicans are doing something else. And if you're going to stand in the way of an infrastructure plan, they're basically trying to argue that infrastructure is specific to bridges and highways. And that's ludicrous. Infrastructure is climate change. It is solar panels. Joe Biden and the Democratic Party should come out and say, we're going to push through a policy that is going to get solar panels on pretty much any house that wants it. And those solar panels are going to cut down the bills of the individuals all throughout America, isolating one of the energy bills or one of the bills that they have to pay almost as a tax. We're going to get rid of that for you. We're Joe Biden with the Democratic Party. We're going to have the Office of Beautification that is going to go out and it's going to do X, Y, Z. Why? Because people need jobs and we're going to provide those jobs. Whatever you need to say for it, I'm just making the point that it should be done. There are things that the government can do that tangibly betters people's lives. And one of those things could be to eliminate some of the bills that people have to pay. This is creating a situation of dominance. You realize that Democrats held the House of Representatives for like 50 years. Republicans win it maybe once or twice. It wasn't until Bill Clinton gets in office with this, destruction of Glass-Steagall, destruction of welfare as we know it, the destruction of the Telecommunications Act, the destruction of an explosion of the prison population, NAFTA, all that stuff was Clinton. And it was at that point where Bill Clinton took all of that cash, did all of those favors, where the House of Representatives started to wish-wash back and forth between Democrats and Republicans. At one point, they owned it. The catch becomes whether this is enough compared to Republicans who don't seem to be pushing much of anything. Is it enough to dominate going forward?
One.
And the answer is probably yes. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my indispensable co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station, 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. Under normal circumstances, we are anyway, and under normal circumstances, my indispensable co-host is with us. But he is out with his bro, but I'm going to be bluntly honest that I'm glad that he's out with his bro. I want him to have a fantastic time because I wanted this interview all to myself. The New York Times writes an article exposing a black budget project set up to study unidentified aerial phenomena, UFOs. They could change the name because they want to change the reference in the way that people think about it. Oh, I like UFOs. In quick succession, videos are released to the public that the Pentagon confirms were from its vaults. Pilots and crew that were part of the Nimitz and the Roosevelt encounter start talking to the press. The Navy changes their protocols to accept pilot testimony. The United States military starts working with an organization that has an explicit focus on UFOs, To the Stars Academy. This collaboration has something to do with metamaterials, but the fact that it exists at all in the open is rather surreal. But the person that started it off as director of that black budget program was gracious enough to grant me an interview. So joining us is Lue Elizondo. He's former director of Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the black budget program that basically was studying UFOs. He has worked in Afghanistan and the Middle East, Latin America as senior counterintelligence officer for the Department of Defense. And as a special agent, Lue has led countless tactical and strategic missions in peace and wartime, in addition to conducting sensitive source operations against some of America's intractable adversaries. Lue, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
It is my sincere and humble privilege to be here with you and your audience today. Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start here. Basic question. Under normal circumstances, people part of the intelligence community don't necessarily start speaking to the press. Why did you come out? Like, what was the impetus for you to come out to basically tell everyone? Because if I remember correctly, and correct me if I'm getting the order of events wrong, New York Times brings out the piece basically saying, hey, this is what the government was doing. And you left the post, left your job at that point, and you started talking to the press and started doing interviews. Is that order correct? Like, what was the order of operations in regards to what took place?
Yeah, I think it's probably most people would recognize that anybody working in an intelligence position typically enjoys anonymity. That being able to operate in shadows for many folks in that career field, it's a matter of life or death in some cases. So I was used to working in the shadows, and that's what I preferred, especially with some of the missions that I was given in the past. My decision to come out and come forward wasn't an easy decision. When I left the Department of Defense, I left because of the lack of transparency into this topic. And before I go much further than that, let me kind of give you a little atmospherics, if you will, of what it was like. I had spent decades working in the intelligence community and national security. And in every case, if there was an issue, a national security issue, there were mechanisms within the bureaucracy to get that information to the right people so they can make good decisions. And this particular case was not that way. It was different. It was hyper compartmentalized. It was very, very secretive. Very few people in the department were even aware of what we were doing, and except for a few at the very top. But unfortunately, the person who needed to have this information most, which was the Secretary of Defense at the time, Jim Mattis, wasn't getting briefed on this topic. And hindsight being 2020, I'm sure there's folks in the department that probably look back and say, well, yeah, we probably should have talked to the boss. But I think they were trying to protect the boss. I've had the honor and privilege of serving with General Mattis at the time, before he was secretary. And then later on, when he became the Secretary of Defense, this is an honorable man. This is an intellectual man. This is a true leader, one of our country's finest. And my experience with him in Afghanistan led me to the understanding that this is a man who wants more information, not less. And for whatever reason, the bureaucracy at the time of the Pentagon was very hesitant to get the boss briefed on this program that, by the way, was we had received $22 million of taxpayer money to fund this program, and the results that we were receiving and analyzing and coming up with, the results of that were very compelling. And despite our best efforts to brief senior leadership, there was resistance, and I suspect because of the taboo and stigma that's historically been associated with this. But my job was national security. I really didn't give a hoot about any type of narratives or even really the topic of UFOs. Right. My concern was that we had something operating in our airspace that we had no idea what it was. We didn't know how it operated. We didn't know who was behind the wheel, and frankly, there wasn't a darn thing we could do about it. Yeah, and that's a problem. And so when I left, I was contacted by the New York Times. New York Times said they're going to do a story. I have a choice. I can either give them my version of it, or they're gonna write my version of it, whether I like it or not. And so I decided very quickly, well, if you're going to write a story, let's try to make it as based in facts as we can, and I will cooperate to the point where obviously I'm not going to provide any classified information, but I'll if it's unclassified, I'll share with you what we were doing.
What is the day in the life of a person who is director of ATTIP? I think that's so wild. I mean, because basically you have this job studying this type of phenomena and determining whether or not it is a threat to basically us. Like you said, you always tell people it's in the Department of Defense or the Department of War. I like the Department of War. That was more honest. But basically their job is to make sure this country and seemingly this world at this point is safe from whatever it is. And so what was the day in the life of a director of ATTIP like?
Wow. No days were the same. Sometimes it was a lot of boredom. And so you'd put your efforts into other portfolios. Other times it was brief moments of sheer terror, especially as information began to roll in, and you would have a video and you'd have an intelligence report accompanying that. It for me, I think the biggest concern was the realization that we were vulnerable, that there was this big gaping vulnerability that nobody seemed to want to address for whatever reason. There was a big elephant in the room, and everybody was turning a blind eye to it. And for me, that's unforgivable. I really don't care what the nature of the threat is. If there's a potential threat, then we need to try to figure it out. And for me, what's even more of a threat than something operating in our airspace, in our controlled airspace that we can't figure out. The only thing more dangerous than that is not being able to have a conversation within your chain of command. Communication's imperative. And when the chain of command, for whatever reason, whether it's politics or bureaucracy or whatever, fails to allow the right information to get to the right people, then that's a problem. That's a big problem. And people in my position, historically, what you don't do is create more of a problem inside the organization. What you do is you take the moral high road and you leave. You leave the organization if you can't make it better, and then you try to do what you can from the outside. And it's really not that uncommon. Let's not forget that Secretary Mattis himself resigned almost a year after I did. So it's not as uncommon as you might think. Sometimes in order to fix a problem, you have to leave the organization that you're trying to fix and maybe do it from the outside.
Speaking about doing it from the outside, and you kind of make a really good point. Did you think it was weird at the presidential conference? I mean, at Joe Biden's first presidential conference, nobody asked him about this. I mean, you have a congressional report that's coming up. You have Congress members talking about it left and right, meaning Marco Rubio would tell anybody, I hope it's not ours. Like, very clear. And talking about it in the context of technology. Nobody's talking about like interdimensional fish. They're talking about it like it's technology. D.N.I. Radcliffe says, creates an uproar saying, yeah, there's a lot of information about it. And you who have given these interviews, I remember Erin Burnett, this is the first time I've ever seen you. Erin Burnett comes on and she's fidgety. She's anxiety-ridden. She's a little freaked out by the topic. And she asks you, do you think we're not alone? And you said, based on my scientific observation, and keep in mind, it goes beyond those blurry videos and it goes to materials and whatnot. Yeah, we're not alone. In which case it went off. And I'm thinking to myself, how does it just leave like that? How does the world just stop there? I mean, because the gravity of what's being said here doesn't necessarily seem to be registering in the way that the public is encountering it. And if Congress could very well debate, I mean, at the very least, is Congress going to really come up with a report dramatically different than the things that you're saying? And how could they, considering you are the one that's briefing many of these guys? They could very well come out and say, we are not alone. And that reality seems lost on him because the questions that they were asking Joe Biden, many of them failed to get to even a wisp of the gravity of that particular statement. What am I missing here? How could they not ask Joe Biden this? And more importantly, if you were at one of those well-paid media companies and they said, Lou, we need you to craft a question, get to the root of the matter with the president of the United States, what would that question be?
Wow. Well, you brought up a few things. Before I answer that last part of it, what would that question be? Let me see if I can address what you initially had stated, which is, why is it making more of an impact? And I think over the last several years, we've been suffering from headline fatigue. This is a country that's been fairly fractured politically and economically. And to some degree now you have on top of that a global pandemic. And of course, in the middle of a political cycle, right? And so you have all these distractions and these headlines du jour all competing for that top slot. So I think part of it is due to that media saturation and headline fatigue. It's just yet here's another headline that now we have to deal with. Another thing maybe as well is that we have a new generation of young folks that are to some degree much more accepting and I hate to say it, but more courageous than my generation. You know, my generation spent a whole lot of time trying to hide under the carpet issues, whether they were geopolitical issues or there were social issues. You know, there was a time when I was in the military, we weren't allowed to have homosexuals in the military. Now, of course, we look back and say, well, that's absurd. How could we ever have felt that way? Well, I lived through that. Okay. And so now we're transitioning and we're evolving as a society, beginning to realize that there was a lot of dumb things my generation did. And it's now really up to the new generation. And I think this new generation is far more accepting of the notion of the idea that, you know, it's okay if we're not alone. You know, it's perhaps that's the natural order of things. And so I think that's part of it. Two, I think because we've had such a long history of stigma and taboo, the first thing you think of when you say not UAP, but UFO are tinfoil hats and people in these little, you know, green alien suits and Elvis on the mothership. And that's not helpful to the conversation because that's artificial stigma that we have, you know, placed on this topic. And I get it. It's easy to think of that. And Hollywood hasn't helped that, you know, that narrative for a long time, many decades. But I think we're at a point now where we have the technology from a national security perspective, where we have clear eyewitness accounts from trained observers. And I mean, millions of dollars spent into their training to identify the difference between a Sukhoi 22, a MiG-25, an F-16, and a European Tornado from 20 miles away. You also have now data collection sensors such as radar, multi-spectrum radar from different locations being used to pick up and these objects and track them. And then also you have now gun camera footage. So when you have three separate collection sensor units, the human being one of them, all reporting the same incident at the same time, at the same place, under the same circumstances, that's an entirely different story than grandma saw some lights in the backyard. This is now multi-million-dollar weapon systems that are able to collect and analyze to some degree what pilots are seeing themselves. And so if this was a jury, right, I look in terms of, for example, a crime, because my background as an investigator, I think we're well beyond reasonable doubt. In this case, the jury would have no choice but to convict because of the overwhelming evidence that we have. Now, the last question you asked me is, why didn't people ask this incoming president this question. I can't answer that, but I can tell you that they're asking now. There's been, besides, we know former DNI Ratcliffe, we have former director of CIA, John Brennan. By the way, two different administrations, right? So it is fairly, I think, a nonpartisan issue. You also have senators coming out and saying, for the record, yeah, these things are real and the information is very compelling. I think we're seeing a change. It was this week where the public affairs officer, the new one for the Pentagon, stated for the record that they are taking this topic very, very seriously.
1 minute till outro.
That's a big deal. You have elements within what we call COCOMs, the major commands, combatant commands of the Department of Defense, all coming out saying, yeah, we're taking this seriously. You have the Director of National Intelligence now coming out and saying, we intend to give Congress a comprehensive report in 180 days. So I guess my response to that is I think that the atmosphere to this conversation is changing. And then the last question is, what would I ask Joe Biden, President Joe Biden, if I had an opportunity? I don't think I would ask him anything. I think I would encourage him to continue to follow this topic. It's very compelling and it's real. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what people think about it because it doesn't care what we think. It's there and it's operating in our controlled U.S. airspace. So we probably should get a handle on it. That's my perspective.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Lue Elizondo, or Lue. Lue's former director of ATTIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the Black Budget Program by the Pentagon to study UFOs. He's worked in Afghanistan, the Middle East, Latin America as a senior counterintelligence officer for the Department of Defense. Trained as a special agent, Lue has led countless tactical and strategic missions in peace and wartime, in addition to conducting sensitive source operations against some of America's intractable adversaries. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines.
Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik.
Peer into the future with Political Misfits on Thursdays, when we analyze the latest trends in news, politics, and culture. Catch us on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Achtung, baby.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I am usually joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're going to continue with the pre-recorded interview with the one and only Lue Elizondo. I begged him to come on to the show, and he was gracious enough to come on. Lue Elizondo is former director of Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the Black Budget Program by the Pentagon to study UFOs. He has worked in Afghanistan, the Middle East, and Latin America as a senior counterintelligence officer for the Department of Defense. Trained as a special agent, Lue has led countless tactical and strategic missions in peace and wartime, in addition to conducting sensitive source operations against some of America's intractable adversaries. Let's continue with the interview.
The president, I would imagine, is being briefed on this. I would think it would be a hard way for him not to be at this point, considering Congress is being briefed on this. I'm curious about the secrecy and how these things are kept secret. Is secrecy basically controlled from executive order, or is it something else? Meaning, does it go beyond the president's, let's say, whims? And can the president be kept out of a project? Meaning, if it's an unacknowledged special access project, can the president basically be in the not no category?
So it's not supposed to work that way. The authorities to classify information does come down from the president as the chief executive for this country, and so you have derivative authorities that trickle down from his or her authorities as president to classify information. Usually, what they call the original classification authority. So several agency heads and department heads have that derivative authority from the president to classify information to make sure it doesn't get in the hands of our adversaries. Primarily, you want to protect two things: sources and methods. So it's really not that complex, and it's never ever designed to be used to keep information away from people who need to know. So the president should always have, just whether it's clandestine operations or even covert activities, the president should always be in the know. Now, beyond the president, there's not a whole lot of folks that necessarily need to be brought into the loop, especially when you're talking about, special access programs and waived SAPs and whatnot. I'm not going to bore you and your audience with the nuances, but the bottom line is that there is someone who should be held accountable. If you're running an operation and the boss, who is supposed to be the ultimate, if you will, arbiter of this, is not being brought into the loop, that's a problem. That's a failure of the command and control of our government. And so it's very dangerous. And then you have rogue operations being run. So the president should never be in the dark, ever. The president represents the will of the people through a duly recognized process of election, and therefore executes the will of the people. And if you're keeping information hidden from the president, then I've got a problem with that. That's a no-no.
But you did say should, not is, if that makes sense.
No, you're right.
I just kind of want to highlight that.
Sometimes it's done for a reason, for plausible deniability. Maybe something is very, very politically sensitive, and they don't want to, if you will, get the boss in any potential political hot water by briefing up on something or her on something. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but it has happened in the past where presidents had no idea we were engaged in a particular operation or activity and were caught flat-footed. That's not usually a good idea. Has it happened in the past? Yeah, absolutely. Is it happening now? I don't know. I hope not. It shouldn't be that way. Fingers crossed that's not the case anymore.
Well, pursuant to that, there are some people. I always ask the question, it's either us or it's not. I used to ask that like 5, 6, 7 years ago because, it's I tried to make the point that it's not swamp gas. And we moved so far beyond the point of swamp gas, I don't even need to make that argument anymore, right?
Right.
But one of the things people say is, well, how do you know they're not trying to cover for black projects? And,
sure,
if I can conceive in my head a situation where, let's say 20 years in advance of the typical regular science, that somebody figures out how to use electricity to manipulate gravity. And would a project like that look like it was from somewhere else, especially in the way it would move and the way it would scatter radar, all of those things?
Those advanced programs, I have in the past, a lot of times in the early days when the B-2 bomber was being tested before anybody knew we had it, people would see this giant flying boomerang and would report UFOs. Same with the F-117 and other secret aircraft, the SR-71 before that. That's not uncommon, but when you have a period of decades where you have this technology, this very advanced technology, operating in a dangerous manner in and around our own technology and our own capabilities, first of all, that's unprecedented. We don't do that. If we want to keep something secret, what we don't do is endanger other military personnel by testing this stuff without their knowledge in their area of operations.
Right.
Furthermore, these aircraft are armed. Second of all, we don't fly them over populated U.S. cities. What we do is we fly them over secret test ranges like Area 51. That's why we have these test ranges. And third, we sure aren't going to use these technologies to interfere with our own nuclear strike capability, which is exactly what has happened in the past. So the argument whether this is some sort of revolutionary technology that we've had for decades and kept under wraps doesn't hold water, that argument, when you look at the fact how these things are operating in controlled U.S. airspace with impunity. There's no ability for us to negate this technology. And by the way, it hasn't just been our military aircraft; it's been civilian aircraft. It's been passenger airliners, where now we have an air flight safety issue. That we don't do that with our own technology. We don't endanger the lives of 250 passengers sitting in a Boeing 747 at 37,000 feet flying at night. We don't do that.
Well, so this is one of those questions that I have that I was trying to figure out what was the best way to get information. I figured I'd just ask. It's impossible to know what you know, so I'm going to rely on your judgment for the moment. Think of everything you've encountered. This includes things from the black, things that you can't tell, things that are whatever, based on questions you've already encountered. What is the most important aspect of this issue, of the UFO issue, or the phenomena, or whatever people want to call it, that you've discussed in the past 10 years?
Wow. That's not an easy question because it's not just one. I mean, you have the issue from a national security perspective that people say, well, how do you know it's a threat? Well, we don't. In order to know something's a threat, you have to have two pieces of a calculus, and that's capabilities versus intent. Now, we've seen what some of these capabilities are, but we have no idea the intent. So we have no idea if this thing is a threat or not. So we have to presume that it could be if it wanted to be, based upon what we're seeing. But then there's other considerations here that are not necessarily national security related. They involve the bigger question about us, about humanity, and what it means to be a human being and to live on our planet and this ecosystem that we call the solar system, right? Is it that we are really alone, or is this what we are encountering just a natural part of existence, and that the cosmic neighborhood is actually far more wonderful than maybe we have given it credit, and so there are a lot of important aspects to this topic, and I certainly am not qualified to tell you or your audience what part is most important, because all of it is important. This is a topic that doesn't belong to any organization, institution, government, religion. It belongs to all of us, and it affects us all equally yet differently. And it depends on the way you were brought up, and maybe the philosophical and theological belief systems that you hold. Maybe there's cultural aspects to this. For some people, this is not a big topic to discuss. You talk to a lot of indigenous people here, and they have oral tradition that goes back 10,000 years, and it involves this topic. It involves what they call part of their Genesis and star people. So this is only, I think, for Western society, maybe a bit of a shock, but there are other cultures and subcultures where this topic doesn't have the stigma and doesn't have the taboo associated with it. It's just part of everyday life and reality for them.
Well, from your perspective, though, because you have an interesting perspective on this, because I think you look at this a little bit more militaristic, but that's just because of your background, what you've worked into this defense. You have far more information than most people have on it, so you have a little bit more context. How do you, from your framing of the world, as you look at this, what would you consider to be, all right, this is the thing that I think is the most important that nobody has asked me, or that somebody has asked? I guess it goes both ways, that someone has asked, but somebody hasn't asked. But it's just from your framing. I'm just curious on how you, what you put your finger down on in regards to right here. This is the thing that I think is people need to focus on.
Sure. Let's look at it this way. Let's say in 5 years, it turns out that this has been some sort of foreign adversarial technology. Let's say Russia or China has developed this technology and has had it for the last, let's say, 3 decades, and has been flying it over our controlled airspace for decades. And simply because we didn't know what it was, because it didn't have a Russian star on the tail or didn't have a Chinese tail number to it, we never had the conversation. And so now we find ourselves in a situation where we've been leapfrogged technologically, and this is considered one of the greatest intelligence failures of our nation. On par, equal with 9/11, minus the casualties. For decades, our entire intelligence apparatus has failed. It hasn't. The information that it's collected has been, if you will, sporadic, and we have failed to inform members of Congress and our leadership in this country of this, even though we knew it was there, but we didn't want to have the conversation because of stigma. That to me is the greatest concern, because it would be a failure at a monumental level of our entire national security apparatus. We would have some very, very serious questions to ask ourselves, and how did we manage to fail so catastrophically? That for me is the worst case scenario. And I think if you listen to some of our elected officials in Congress, they've kind of echoed that too. It's almost easier to think that this is of an origin not from here than to think of the alternative
10
sort of foreign adversary.
We gotta do quick out.
Okay.
Excuse the pun, but by light years, and now we're faced with the consequences. That's very disturbing.
The voice that you guys are listening to is Lue Elizondo, director or former director of Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program, the Black Budget Project that was studying UFOs for the Pentagon. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left corner, I am your ever-vigilant, your indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And in the independent corner, Shane Stranahan, my indispensable co-host, is not here today, but he will be back on Monday. And that means, with the both of us, you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. So let's get to the headlines. The conversation with Lue was fascinating. There's another 40 minutes of that conversation that gets wilder and wilder as it goes on. He's very thoughtful. He was squirming in the interview because some of the questions that were being asked, especially as it got later on. So I'm considering showing that other part in a different segment, maybe a part 2 or part 3. But the rest of the interview is on my channel if you guys want to see the entirety of it. So let's get to the headlines. In the news. In COVID news, the New York Times is reporting at least 955 new coronavirus deaths and 77,718 new cases in the United States on April 1st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 65,575 cases per day, an increase of 20% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, more than 30,562,800 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and more, or up to 545,000, more than that, have died. Per Washington Post, Swedish pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca faced fresh challenges to its coronavirus vaccine as Britain's medicine regulator said Thursday that it found 30 cases of a rare blood clot events following the shot's use. And Australia announced that it was investigating a possible link between the vaccine and clotting in a man who was recently immunized. The European Union's drug regulator and World Health Organization have both vouched for the safety of the vaccine, jointly produced by Oxford University and AstraZeneca, in recent weeks amid growing concerns that it may have caused perhaps dozens of rare blood clot disorders in Europe out of tens of millions of administered doses. And this was per the Washington Post. You know, the wild part about this is it's 30 out of tens of millions. They add that in there. I guess they're trying to make the point like out of tens of millions of people who used it, 30 showed signs. And I guess implied in that is that maybe they shouldn't care about 30. I don't know. I'm of mind that it does make sense for regulators to want to know whether or not something is indicated in regards to a particular drug. If you are that rare 31st person, and you find out that there is some aspect of the individual's physiology that interacts with it in some particular way, that 99.9% won't have any issues at all. But you would want to know if it was some kind of rare, weird anomaly that you have that interacts with the vaccine. They gave me, I believe it was hepatitis C vaccine. I forget the exact one. But what they realized was my body doesn't necessarily produce antibodies for it. I can't remember the exact one, but it does produce antibodies. And so it's one of those things that they have to continuously check to make sure that I didn't necessarily come down with that particular virus, since my body doesn't produce vaccines for it, even with the shot. I guess I'm making the point that people have strange physiology at certain points, and that strange physiology can interact with things in weird ways. I don't think it's horrible or bad or wrong that the agency decided to check. By the same token, this is like immigration. If you make a choice, just because you make an ethical choice or right or moral choice, doesn't necessarily mean that the results are good. Joe Biden can say, I care about the kids, I care about the babies, I don't want the babies having to walk all the way back to their country, gangs, drugs, etc., etc. By the same token, that also means that you're going to have a lot of kids coming to your border, and regardless of you saying stay away, those kids are going to come to the border because you've just said you're opening the border to kids. It's very straightforward. Well, the same thing is true with this. The moment that you say, I'm going to double check, I'm going to make sure that this vaccine is safe, and you can come back out 2 weeks later and say, all right, all good. But the damage is done. The number of people at this point, despite it being 30 out of several million, you freaked people out by something that people were already on some level freaked out on. The United States, if you remember, think back to when we launched the vaccines. What did we do? We launched it in a way that tried to get it across that this is cool. This is the thing that's going to get you out. The jab. You're going to get the jab. And this, they would have Joe Biden getting the jab. You'd have, Oprah Winfrey getting the jab on television. I'm not saying she did. I'm just saying you would have all of these celebrities come out to get the jab. They were trying to do everything in their power to get across to people that this is safe, this is effective, and if you want to get back to some level of normality, this is the pathway to do so. Not fear. Meaning, if they would have came out and said anything was wrong with that vaccine at any part of that process, it would have crippled the ability to get the vaccine out. If you want to look at the differences, look at the way the United States was able to get the vaccine out compared to Europe. Europe has been a basket case. The U.S. has actually done a pretty decent job in getting the vaccine out. Florida Republican Representative Matt Gaetz is being investigated by the Justice Department over sex trafficking allegations. Gaetz has denied the allegations, saying, quote, no part of the allegations against me are true, unquote. On Tuesday, Gaetz claimed that he was a victim of an extortion plot, which the FBI is investigating separately. Multiple sources have confirmed to CNN that Gaetz made a name for himself in Congress by bragging about his sexual escapades with women to his colleagues. People with knowledge of Gaetz' actions, including 2 people directly shown the material, said Gaetz displayed the images of women on his phone and talked about having sex with them. This included even while on the House floor. According to one source, one of Gaetz' videos showed the video of an unfortunate naked woman with a hula hoop. I'm assuming she was using it. A source noted, quote, it was a point of pride for Gaetz. I bet it was. Look, from the standpoint of the sex trafficking, that is rather serious. And like you said, the investigation is taking place, so we will know one way or the other, I suppose, after the investigation. From Gaetz' standpoint, he is arguing that he is the victim of an extortion plot. So there's that part. So this is a very weird and strange story. The other element to this is what it means to be a guy, and what does society define being a man as. And what I mean by that is, if you look at movies, if you look at stories, if you look at literature, we have a certain expectation of men being strong, and we have a certain expectation of men as being horn dogs. Meaning the guy chases the woman. The guy chases the woman for the entire film. She tells him no 1,000 times, and he keeps stalking. But in the movie, they don't call it stalking. They call it sweet, affectionate, and him being proactive in trying to get the woman of his dreams. I'm just making the point that from the standpoint of men growing up in this society, there are certain expectations. And one of those expectations is vigor. The ability to go after women, and men are prized for their ability to do that. Gaetz, who's conservative, Republican, I would imagine he's showing his pictures to other Republicans. Well, this is not an excuse for Gaetz. This is more so a, I don't know, excuse is not the right word. A kind of an is what it is, what it is. The guy that's sitting beside his wife right now is probably very nervous, but that guy pretty much knows somebody just like Gates. Not the trafficking stuff, just the braggadocious stuff. Think back to Donald Trump when he was having the conversation to grab him by the you-know-what. I kept saying that conversation was not abnormal in the way that some of the guys were acting like it was abnormal. They just didn't want to give heads up that they've been in the room with men having those conversations, being in the locker room or apparently on the House floor of Congress. The fourth day of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial resumed hearing testimonies on Thursday, including an emotional account from Courtney Ross, Floyd's girlfriend, on the couple's past struggles with drug addiction. Chauvin's former supervisor testified that he should have stopped using force after Floyd was handcuffed on the ground, and Minneapolis paramedic Derek Smith testified that when he arrived on the scene, Floyd already appeared to be dead. Look, that is the point. You had the guy down. He stopped. You had 3 other officers around you. There was no issue where he was still fighting back. Your knee is on his throat. At which point do you stop putting pressure on his throat? Meaning, if you need to make an argument to me that you had to subdue a suspect, fair enough. Nobody would complain about that. The complaint has to do with not stopping the maximum justice, and the maximum justice being continuous all the way through for 8 minutes, despite the fact that the guy had been dead for like 5. That's the problem. There's a sadistic quality to that. And, when people watch that, I suspect that the reason there was so much energy around the world after watching something like that was because it hit at the core of the depravity of this issue. Cops kill 1,000 people a year. I keep making that point because that number is astonishing, with 99% not being charged. If Chauvin walks, that will be the most normal thing in the world, despite the fact that it will be one of the most immoral tragedies that we've come across. Doesn't matter if he was on drugs. It matters that he was killed. There's a difference in those things. On Wednesday evening, 1 person was injured and 4 were killed, including a 9-year-old boy in a mass shooting at an Orange office complex. Authorities said the shooting took place inside a real estate and manufactured home business, Unified Homes, and that the gunman and victims were connected through business and personal ties. Officers fired through a locked gate, wounding the gunman. 2 officers fired their weapon. Both were wearing body cameras. Few details were immediately available about the motive for the shooting or details about the victims. Another mass shooting. Another mass shooting. After failing to define Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, 2 Republican aides are telling Axios they learned their lesson. Did you now? Their game plan this time around is to try to convince voters that the infrastructure legislation is more of a wish list for progressives than a, quote, roads and bridges, unquote, measure. Axios is reporting that a new memo from House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says, quote, Biden's so-called infrastructure plan spends less than 6% to repair bridges, highways, and roads. The rest is a kitchen sink of wasteful progressive demands, unquote. They honest to God believe that calling something progressive is a way of undermining it. You are insane. The overwhelming majority of the public backed the $15 an hour. The overwhelming majority of the public backed the elimination of student debt. At the very least, the $50,000 removal. The majority of the population backed an expansion of Social Security. They backed a Green New Deal or some element of a Green New Deal. I'm making a point to you that calling it progressives is not in and of itself a way to castigate the plan, especially when everybody was trying to rub themselves in Sanders. That should give you this notion that it is not unpopular. What is unpopular is you and trying to undermine either the $1.9 trillion COVID plan or the infrastructure plan. The infrastructure plan will be dramatically popular and will be the thing that will create jobs. Good luck going against that. Good luck. U.S. Senator Chris Murphy and Representative Ro Khanna, both Democrats, addressed the stalemate between the United States and Iran regarding the return to the 2015 nuclear agreement and urged the administration to, quote, to be open and willing to take steps back into the deal, unquote. Speaking on Wednesday at a webinar hosted by the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, Murphy said that he is writing a letter to Senator Tim Kaine that would, quote, make clear that there's a sizable constituency in the United States Senate for the compliance approach. Maximum pressure was a miserable 100% failure, Murphy said. And so we get ready to re-enter the JCPOA. And so as we get ready to re-enter the JCPOA, it is important to remind the opponents of the agreement that their arguments have been tested. The argument has failed. Now is the work to get back to the agreement as quickly as possible. The United States was the first to leave, and so the United States shouldn't be wary of taking the first steps back to the agreement. There is no weakness in the United States admitting that, but for our non-compliance, the JCPOA would still be alive and well today. And so, both in private and in public, I have counseled the administration to adopt compliance for compliance approach to be open and willing to take steps back to the deal. Thank you! Somebody said it. Somebody said just an honest thing. We shot the JCPOA in the face. We left the deal. We included a pressure strategy. We started killing off their people after the deal. Maybe we should be the ones to get back to the deal first to allow compliance for Iran to come back to the deal. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that, Chris Murphy. I've been wondering why somebody couldn't look and say the obvious truth. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Those are your headlines. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
So Sean, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No, it's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, I mean, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, I guess just me today, on whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can do so with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So China has made a deal with Iran. China has agreed to invest over $400 billion over 25 years in exchange for a steady supply of oil to fuel its growing economy and security agreement. The draft, this is for the New York Times, the draft detailed $400 billion of Chinese investments to be made in dozens of fields, including banking, telecommunications, ports, railways, healthcare, information technology over the next 25 years. In exchange, China will receive a regular and, according to an Iranian official and an oil trader, heavy discounted supply of Iranian oil. The draft also calls for deepening military cooperation, including joint training and exercises, joint research, and weapons development and intelligence sharing. That is profound. Joining us to have a conversation about this and the implications of this, I mean, after all, the United States still has sanctions on Iran and is still working to mitigate it. So the idea that China is working in military cooperation is pretty profound. The voice, or the person that we're going to speak to, is Ian Goodrum. He's a senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Ian, thank you for joining us.
And thanks for having my voice and personage on the show.
Absolutely. So this 25-year deal, it piqued my interest. It piqued my interest for a few counts. The Biden administration still hasn't necessarily removed sanctions. He seems to want to go back to the deal, but he doesn't necessarily know how to get back to the deal. And I think part of that has to do with this notion of saving face. Iran, who also wants to save face in this, there is no impetus to go back to the deal from the standpoint of the U.S. if they don't give her the sanctions. And the moderates have been burned, which means that it is that much harder to make that deal because the moderates have been burned. China, working with Iran right now, on some level, looks like it would stabilize Iran. Meaning if they're going to invest this much across the board like this, it creates this weird scenario where China is investing in Iran, whereas the United States is trying to undermine it. It's very strange. What are your thoughts on this? How do you frame this? I mean, the 25-year deal is a big deal in regards to cooperation for that side of the globe, especially if you add in Russia and China to that mix. That's basically Russia, China, and Iran, and basically a cooperation, a fulcrum of sorts. How do you see this from your standpoint?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, the discussion, the Biden administration kind of hinting at maybe possibly rejoining the JCPOA, but not saying anything in terms of removing the sanctions it unilaterally imposed on Iran in the first place. It's strange. It's strange also that there's a reticence to do that because it's an easy strategy to reverse the policy. You just say, well, that was a Trump policy. We don't like Trump, so we're reversing it. But there's been a lot of the bad policies pushed by the Trump administration that the Biden administration is continuing, not least of which is its campaign against China and Iran, as we're seeing. As far as the deal, I mean, it's been bigged up in the media quite a lot because Iran is one of those scary countries that the media talks about with like cartoon lightning flashing behind whatever story they're writing and an owl hooting in the background. But it's a Middle Eastern country like many other Middle Eastern countries, and a comprehensive strategic partnership is a foreign policy tool that China uses in a lot of places. The UAE has one with China. Iraq has one with China. So the reason why it hasn't been as aggressively pursued was because there were these sanctions being placed on Iran before the JCPOA, not just from the U.S. but from the UN. Not unilateral sanctions, but multilateral sanctions. The sanctions that China opposed, but that the UN that there was a greater impetus for international action because of the supposed risk of the Iran nuclear program. But then, of course, with the signing of the agreement that led to what we have now, what the U.S. had previously signed on with, along with the EU and China and Russia, those sanctions were lifted. And so the reimposition of sanctions from strictly the U.S. creates an opening for China to restart its economic partnership and its strategic partnership because there are no longer the risks associated with violating international sanctions. So this was a long time coming, and it's a fairly typical foreign policy tool, but it is still important because, as you say, the sanctions imposed by the U.S. are very far-reaching because of the power of the U.S. dollar. So providing an alternate route for goods and resources is going to help the people of Iran more than anybody else.
Yeah, that's going to be big. I mean, I guess my thought is, from the standpoint of Iran having a secondary source, I think my thought is that China, when the United States made this argument about the Uyghurs and basically was able to get the rest of the world to join in and go after them, passing sanctions on China and everything else, in my head, China realized that it's not going to get a fair shake, and a certain level of proactive and maybe even aggressiveness is going to be necessary to push back. That has to do with the report that China released on human rights in the United States. That's one pushback. But I also think international cooperation and the deal with Iran is one of those deals. The deal with Russia is one of those deals. I mean, even the Belt and Road Initiative on some level, even though it's an economic cooperation, it also on some level allows it to be able to move its products in the various countries and everything else. It allows a pathway that goes around the attacks by U.S. and Western allies. Was that the way you're viewing this? I mean, even this conversation of the back and forth between Blinken and the Chinese representative or the Chinese diplomat, even that gets across this difference in tenor, where he makes the point to him that you are not in a dominant station to be talking to me in this way. I think that's a new lease on life on some level. Even the way Biden talks about this. I mean, for the first time, I heard a president get up there at a press conference and basically make it sound like the U.S. was competing against China, not the other way around. And that the reason and the angst has to do with competition. That this belief, this fear that China is going to leapfrog the United States. I mean, China has 1.3 billion people. The United States is 300 million. I mean, at some point, if they accentuate or manifest their technology, at some point you would imagine that they would be ahead. But it just gets across that it seems the main impetus of this is we don't want to be in the rears. We don't want another country getting ahead of us, be it technologically or economically. What are your thoughts on this? That's the way I took China, as almost like learning something and saying that we can't sit back. We have to be more proactive in pushing back on, you could say, world aggression or world bellicosity. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, there's a few things. I mean, first of all, the rest of the world didn't impose sanctions on China over Xinjiang. That was the U.S., the U.K., Australia, and the EU, right?
Well, I thought it's the Western nations. If I did,
sure. Yeah, but that's true. You know, Anglophone nations mostly, and the EU as well. But and this deal has been a long time coming, so it's not necessarily strictly a response to recent actions, although there's been a heightened aggression against China for many years now, going back even farther than Trump. You know, the Obama so-called pivot to Asia was clearly a containment measure aiming to constrain China's rise and halt its development. But as far as like international, I just want to throw in this, you know, there's been kind of back and forth in terms of international statements about the situation in Xinjiang, and most recently Cuba was the main speaker on behalf of, I believe, over 70 countries, saying that they supported China's policies versus the, I think, 30-something that signed on to an opposition resolution being led by the U.S. So world opinion is if not divided, in leaning one way. But yeah, I think there is some fairness to what you say. I think it's true that, you know, China is willing and happy to engage in cooperation and be reasonable and a rational partner, but the U.S., even again, not just with Trump, but as it's seeming to be with Biden, whose State Department is continuing Pompeo's last-minute declaration of genocide. Blinken has repeated that. You know, this was an opportunity to kind of ratchet back tensions. Well, you don't ratchet down tensions by accusing someone of genocide. It's a very serious accusation. So yes, I think it's fair that there is a redirection in some ways toward the global South. But again, this has been long coming. You know this. So that what's called South-South cooperation has been a major part of China's foreign policy for many years now. Nations of the global South, as China defines it, making agreements and cooperating with one another on their own terms, as opposed to terms that are dictated by some outside force. And most clearly, this is the West. So I think there is some truth to kind of the ramping up of these interactions. But at the same time, you know, trade is still going on. The U.S. is still China's biggest trading partner, and China is still the U.S.'s biggest trading partner. So, I mean, this is despite the wailing and gnashing of teeth going on and the overblown fears of Chinese competition and Chinese aggression, assertiveness, whatever you want to call it, there is still normal economic activity taking place. But of course, we can't remove those from the political concerns that we're seeing all the time. So, yeah, I certainly the relationship is changed to a degree, but China has made clear much as Iran has made clear when it comes to the U.S. trying to get back to the table in terms of rejoining the nuclear agreement is, well, if you want to engage with us, you need to do so, like you mentioned, and as Yang Jia mentioned, not from this position of lecturing and this position of imposing one's will. I don't think China would have a problem at all with the U.S. treating it as an equal, as opposed to this great threat or this great. And doesn't even oppose the idea of it being a competitor, but there is such a thing as friendly competition, right? There is such a thing as competition that's not life or death. There's boxing and then there's knife fights, right? So there are degrees. And I think China's concern is that the U.S. has drawn its sword, shall we say?
I'm curious. We only have about 30 seconds before we have to come back, but what did China learn from the Soviet Union? I'm very curious about that. And because the reason why I say that is, and you can answer when we come back, it's just one of the major opponents from the context of the United States. Like if you're looking back, if I'm studying an opponent, and in studying that opponent, I'm looking back at previous things that person did. Let's say if you're playing a game or something. But in the context of nations, I would imagine that something similar has to be done, where you're looking back, you're analyzing what has the country did in the past, how has it behaved, and what are the examples that we want to take and the things that we want to avoid. And one of those major competitors from the U.S. was the Soviet Union. And I'm curious on how China views itself in the context of the Soviet Union being this kind of secondary thing, or this competitor to the United States. And oddly enough, in a similar way, that the Soviet Union was a competitor to the United States, this kind of superpowers. Let's do this. Let's take a break. The voice that you guys are listening to is Ian Goodrum. He's senior editor and columnist at China Daily. We're going to be back with Ian in a moment. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're joined by our guest, Ian Goodrum. He's senior editor and columnist at China Daily. Before we left, I asked this question about basically what did China learn from the Soviet Union in regards to how it's dealing with world politics, definitely, but specifically in its association or relationship with the United States. I mean, China comes across to me as trying to have win-win relationships, if it can. Whereas the U.S. comes across as zero-sum. And in the context of the Soviet Union, when it was understood that, look, we're not going to take a step forward in regards to bringing NATO forward. We're not going to inch up with NATO. We're not going to take advantage. And both of those things were violated almost immediately. So how does China see this? What's their perspective on these things going forward? And did they learn anything in the way that the Soviet Union and the United States were interacting with one another? Or do they consider themselves just separate and distinct from that dynamic? What are your thoughts?
Oh, no. I mean, I think that's a topic that's frequently discussed. It's very important because it was the, to the CPC and the leadership, it was a great tragedy of the end of the October Revolution, essentially. And so learning from those mistakes, those errors, is key. And I think one of the big things in terms of foreign policy is China sees the Soviet Union as a place that was attempting to export revolution, right? That was taking kind of ideological sides in conflicts, which China did as well in the years since 1949 and in the years after 1970, in the early 1970s, when the U.S. and China rebuilt their relations, and then China took the side of the U.S. in foreign policy disputes against the Soviet Union. But since '78 and especially since '79, the last time that China was engaged in a conflict with another country, the policy has been a more neutral stance. They considered the Soviet Union getting entangled, getting involved in the affairs of other countries as being a negative. Now, you can argue whether those causes were just or right. I would argue that they were, but it can't be denied that tying up resources and tying one's political capital up and economic resources into these entanglements wasn't helpful. It didn't benefit to a very great degree. It didn't benefit to a great degree the domestic economy and the people's desire for the stereotype of consumer goods being the deciding factor in people throwing off the shackles of communism. That's the popular narrative, and I disagree with a great deal of it. But there are some true aspects of it in that the narrative being pushed by the capitalist bloc was successful in painting the West and the capitalist nations as these wealthy and prosperous places with abundance and comforts, while the post-socialist economies discovered that comfort was really built on the backs of working class in the U.S. and around the world, and that the vast majority of people didn't live such a lifestyle. But that was a harsh lesson that I think many now look back with regret and nostalgia, as China does. But it's a stated policy of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, right? China does not arm national liberation movements anymore. They don't fund national liberation movements anymore. Now, some left critics will say that's a bad thing. I understand where they're coming from, but I also understand where China's coming from, in that they don't want to repeat the errors they see as causing the collapse of the Soviet Union. So, it's win-win cooperation, South-South cooperation, non-interference, which does go back to 1960, when China laid out its policies, its principles on foreign aid, which includes mutual benefit. It's never been purely altruistic or purely predatory. It is about benefiting both sides of whatever agreements are being entered into. So yes, I mean, I think that's one of many lessons. I think there's other domestic lessons that they've learned, but in terms of foreign policy, they see it as a need to stay out of people's business, basically, and just engage on a more neutral level. So that does mean, that like Maoist insurgencies in India and the Philippines don't get support from the Communist Party of China, which has led those insurgencies to label the Communist Party as revisionist and all these things. So the CPC has basically made the choice not to do what it used to do, and for better or for worse, that's the policy. I try to be agnostic about this sort of thing because I can see both sides, but that's how I see it as well.
Yeah, the non-interference thing it makes sense. I mean, if you think about it, like you said, the goal, it's like the moment that you get involved in other countries, it's almost like you're stuck with the outcome. And often it doesn't work out right. Like if you think of, like there's usually side effects, like Afghanistan. The United States invests itself into the Mujahideen to draw the Soviet Union into a Vietnam-esque war. And that ends up becoming Al-Qaeda, which ends up hitting us on 9/11. It's like the stuff is never the best political strategist. There's usually some kind of flaw or defect in it. Non-interference seems to be a little bit more ideal. I'm curious about Taiwan, for example. Some of the reports are coming out that there were either flybys, they were either drones, and there are reports that there are concerns about some kind of attack on Taiwan. I understand that China considers Taiwan its own territory. Are they considering that? I mean, is that something that's really in consideration, or this something that's overblown that's being kind of pushed up?
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, right? These flybys get reported on with great anguish and concern by the media, but this is almost entirely these are responses to an action taken by the U.S. Right? I mean, it's the same thing with the South China Sea, where the U.S. will send warships into the South China Sea for so-called freedom of navigation exercises.
Right. I was about to say that those are freedom of navigation exercises, Ian. That's all they are. They're just for freedom of movement.
That's right. That's right. Freedom of navigation for a destroyer and an aircraft carrier. That's exactly right. Because we need to make sure those guys, their engines work. Yeah. So I mean, like you see very one-sided kind of reports where they might mention the kind of catalyst action taken by the U.S. to provoke in like paragraph 7 or 8, but the headline is, of course, China does this, China does that, and so people think, oh well, China's being very aggressive and assertive and expansionist and all this stuff. So
I'm curious. Speaking about that, what do you like?
It's very one-sided kind of thing.
It's one-sided, and they drop context. This has been a thing that has been bothering me like nobody's business for the last I don't know the year that I've worked here. They drop context. Like, for example, they would report China flew planes near Taiwan in an aggressive capacity, raising fears of the specter that China is going to attack Taiwan. They would say that. But then they would immediately say North Korea fired missiles, but they would leave out the fact that North Korea or that China, South Korea and the United States were doing these military exercises where they were pretending like they were going to invade the country. So basically, I'm being told in one sense that flying by is so important that it gives an imminence of an attack. By the same token, the pretending that you're about to attack a country doesn't get aired in conversations about why the country responded in the way it responded. How do you
exactly.
How do you process that, right?
Because you work in news. Doing like decapitation drills are fine, but if you fly fighter jets, then that's a bigger provocation. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so strange.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same phenomenon. Yeah. I mean, hey, what works for DPRK works for China, right? Like the same playbook. It's a songwriter singing the hits, right? They know what works, and it does work, right? If you portray it this way, people are going to be passively consuming it as media, because people don't actively consume media for the most part unless you're in the industry, and it's your job to kind of more look at this in more detail. Then you just consume it. It just goes in one ear and out the other, and over time it becomes an accumulated kind of idea of a place, and so you get stories X, Y, and Z, or about topics X, Y, and Z repeated often enough, and then that becomes the received wisdom. So then you could go into, there's a laundry list of topics that get beaten to death in the media that create this perception of the countries that the U.S. wants to designate as opponents, as adversaries, as threats, and this stuff works. So.
That stuff does work.
Once you notice it, it becomes impossible not. Like once you realize what's going on, it becomes impossible not to notice it, and it drives you absolutely crazy, which it does to me as well all the time.
Yeah, it's insane. Because then they would say those guys are propaganda outlets, but they wouldn't deal with, okay, what did we say that was wrong? That never comes up. It's always this kind of castigation of it. And it's something, another point to that. All of this talk and all of the attacks on China over the past several years has created a certain perspective in the culture. And Joe Biden would say, in one breath, they're committing genocide. But in the other breath, he would say, well, we need to protect our populations from a rising increase in Asian violence. And he doesn't see how the two are related. They've been attacking China for years. Oh, they're stealing our jobs. Well, no, they didn't steal your jobs. Corporations took your jobs over there so they can make a buck. They can make extra profit. And nobody stole your jobs. Or the virus, the China virus. Well, again, this is something that is being used to basically castigate an entirety of a country, and it is creating hate crimes or the conditions for those hate crimes. How is China talking about this? Like, how do they perceive this? Because they have to see the increases in violence against people who are of Asian descent, particularly Chinese.
No, I mean it's something that I talk about with my Chinese friends all the time. It gets brought up constantly because people see the video footage. They see it makes them outraged, as it should. I mean, it makes me outraged. For a long time, I think there was kind of a passive dismissal of certain media narratives. Like, that's the thing about the so-called propaganda outlets. I mean, here's the thing, right? If the U.S. has propaganda outlets. They are just extremely effective and insidious to the point where people think they're reading the truth when they read the news as opposed to reading propaganda. Well, if you have a if you have an openly state-owned outlet, then there is a certain understanding among people that read it, the domestic population, that to a degree they are reading propaganda. But that makes our jobs. That makes our jobs for me, if I work at a state outlet, which I do, that just puts the impetus on me to do a good job and try to be effective and detail oriented and smart and correct whenever I say these things, because there is a certain amount of disbelief you have to overcome. So in a way, I mean, it makes the job. I think in an interesting way, it makes what we report and what we say more accurate. But yeah, so for a while there was like a dismissal of like the idea of Americans being racist. This idea of like, well, they're just saying it to kind of shore up their own position. We don't know if it's really true. Well, here it is right in front of you in black and white security footage of these people getting attacked. And of course the police violence that is now being filmed by people that have phones. So there has been a greater understanding of the reality of the situation, where what was previously dismissed as propaganda is now being widely understood as being true. You mentioned earlier the U.S. human rights violations report. Well, that gets put out every single year by China. It's kind of an annual event where they put it out, and there's always new things to add. And this year's was a doozy. And yeah, I mean,
they start that report off. I can't breathe.
Say yes.
Yeah, they start their report off saying, "I can't breathe."
Started off with the George Floyd quote. Yeah, and so, this gets more notice now because people are starting to realize that, because there was a previously very rosy perception of the U.S. I think among the majority of regular Chinese people, and of course, if you're an American in China, you're treated very well. There's no, I've never experienced any kind of negative event where I was mistreated or spoken to poorly because of my national origin. If it did happen, I don't know that I would be that upset because it's hard to blame. It would be hard to blame them, but it hasn't happened.
Yeah, we're going to have to end this here because we're coming up to the break, and I guess it's coming up soon. But look, I really appreciate this conversation. And you're right. It's off-putting to see the level of violence that has been increasing. And I've had friends of mine that are from other countries, not even China, and she's talking about how she's scared, she's terrified, and those type of things. So yeah, you're right. The voice that you guys were listening to is Ian Goodrum. He's the senior editor and columnist at China Daily. And you can follow Ian on Twitter at isgoodrum. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Evo Morales' party, MAS, Movement Towards Socialism, may have won the election from the coup government, but Bolivia is still recovering from a year under the Arnaz regime. Reporting from working class district in Bolivia's city of Cochabamba is Camila Escalante. Let's play the clip.
When the coup took place in 2019, the regime began intimidating leaders and residents of the Zona Sur of Cochabamba. This was one of the hottest points during the coup, with major anti-coup protests beginning in response to Evo's forced resignation. Confrontations between residents and police ensued, stemming from protests which arose in response to the regime's disastrous COVID lockdown measures. Mobilizations turned into anti-hunger protests at times, and people demanded a flexibilization of the quarantine to be able to work, to eat, and support their families.
Salir a las calles pidiendo a las personas que estábamos juntamente, en otras palabras, pidiendo trabajo para poder sustentar a nuestras familias, había sido delito. Ha sido una persecución política en su gobierno de la señora Áñez.
All they wanted to do was work. Hundreds of people from this area were arrested during protests. They tell me that on November 11th, 2019 alone, 150 residents were arrested within moments. Arturo Murillo, the regime's interior minister, looked for ways to persecute leaders and created one with a false accusation that residents here had knocked down a telecommunications antenna in Caracara. With that accusation, 4 people were jailed. This is just one of many cases involving arbitrary detention, arrest, and political persecution. Around the country, political prisoners of the coup, including the ones I spoke to here, reported torture, coercion, and physical violence, gassing, tasering, and asphyxiation, extortion, and rape, employed by the police, guards, and other officials of the coup regime.
Wow. The voice of the reporter that you guys were listening to is Camila Escalante. Camila Escalante is a TV news producer and presenter at Telesur English who also works at Kashwan News. Camila, thank you for joining us. That is a great report. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me this morning.
Absolutely. Torture, rape. So these were protests that were taking place basically to push back against the coup regime and the lockdown measures. I guess people were put into a similar position as here. They had to work. And in this case, it sounds like they were protesting and the coup government was basically attacking them. I mean, that's astonishing. So the cases that you were talking about, were there consequences after the coup government left? Are the protesters who were locked up still in jail? Like, how has this washed out since the MAS, since RC come to power? Arce.
So, as you said, President Luis Arce was inaugurated in November, on November 8th, following the October elections. And it took about a month for the political prisoners of the coup year to be released. They were released in December, and many of them continue to fight charges. And so they've been on house arrest, unable to work. So since they can't work, they're unable to pay legal fees and feed their families. So it's just a continuation of their, of the total, economic hardship that they've had to take on because of these false accusations. What the people tell me here in the Department of Cochabamba, who participated in those anti-coup protests and those anti-hunger protests and the anti-lockdown protests, they say that the charges against them were planted, that they were essentially false flags because the minister of government under the coup regime was looking for ways to criminalize the people who continued since the moment that Evo stepped down. They continued finding things to protest about and mobilize in the streets against the regime. And so eventually the interior minister went ahead and planted these charges. And now under Luis Arce, these people are hoping to find justice in terms of clarifying their own situations, getting the charges dropped and being able to, reincorporate themselves into work, daily work. But also they want to see justice against, sorry, there's a friendly dog in the background.
No,
so
you're fine. You're
want
fine.
to see justice, in terms of seeing Janine Áñez and her regime be tried, in the way that some of them will be. A small handful of them, of course, as you know, have now been arrested and are in pre-trial detention.
So, from the standpoint of the people who were responsible for this, I mean, I would imagine some of these were police, some of these might have been military. Have those, excuse me, I know Arnez is being prosecuted currently. What about the other people that were involved in this? I mean, this wasn't just one or two people. This seems like the police force itself was being used by the coup mongers or by the coup leaders.
So there are just a couple of members of the military and police who are also now facing charges and in pre-trial detention as the investigations continue. But unfortunately, the two most important people under the Janine Áñez coup administration left in November. They left at the time that Luis Arce was taking office through Brazil towards the United States, now in Florida, of course, and that's the Minister of Government or the Interior Minister, and also the head of the Armed Forces, the Defense Minister. Those two people were able to escape. It'll be very difficult to bring them to justice if they're in Miami.
Wow, so they made a beeline to the United States. They started writing on the wall. That is very interesting. So how has Arce been able to pull this back from the brink at this point? I mean, I would imagine coming behind, let's say, the coup government in this situation, there's all sorts of things that were probably broken, all sorts of situations that was not resolved. How is he, I guess, putting all of this back together? And not just putting it back together, maintaining his power base. Because if it happened once, it's very possible that some of the people who were involved in that are just waiting for the opportunity for it to happen again.
Yeah, I mean, the social movements here are the ones who are demanding that these people be brought to justice. It's already taken 4 months for the small handful of people to be issued arrest warrants and scooped up by authorities. But this is amid international pressure from Washington and its allies demanding the release of these people.
Right.
These people are, Washington, the OAS, Luis Almagro, the EU, here in Bolivia, the Catholic Church, and the other right-wing figures are demanding the release, saying that Janine Áñez faces, abuses, that there's no due process. But of course, we've seen the images and the ways in which she's being held in pretrial detention. She has above standard rooms. She's had very special medical care because she has high blood pressure, and she's been, receiving outside visits and has a lot of people lobbying for her.
Yeah.
So, it remains to be seen how in any way she's experiencing things the way in which a regular detainee would be treated here. And so it's very important that the government, continue to reject the calls for her release, which are completely baseless. People want to see these people tried, and the moment they're released or allowed to be on house arrest, they will find a way to escape just the way the others have. It's not just the former defense minister and the interior minister who have escaped. Very high-ranking people in the military and police were also able to escape.
Just so we're clear, if you had the opportunity to have a conversation with one of these journalists at Reuters that use 1,000 words to not call a coup, what would you say to them? How would you make that point that no, in real terms, this was a coup, and it is a travesty that you guys can't basically call a military coup a coup? And what is the reason that you think they have such a hard time seeing what is obviously true?
Well, working at Telesur, of course, we were very, following the situation here in Bolivia very closely during the entire 2019, following up to the elections and the period post-elections during those conflicts. And we literally have multi-viewers. We have screens on our walls. We watch the different channels. And, at any point in time, at least 2 of those screens are Bolivia TV and Abya Yala television. Those 2 channels were taken off air. We saw reports from the journalists themselves saying people here are taking us out of the network station. There were mobs outside threatening the just media workers, and not necessarily famous journalists. We're talking about just people who hold lighting or cameramen. Every single person was threatened until the point so they had to leave the station. They shut down those networks. They were taken off air, so we couldn't see what was going on. Then, when I came here and arrived here during the coup, every single channel was Janine Áñez and coverage of her taking power and what she was saying. And they were calling the mass supporters terrorists, saying they were guilty of sedition, but they were only showing one side of what was going on. It was very clear by the fact that they had to shut down the airwaves and persecute the people who were reporting what was actually happening, that something was
30
covered up while the military and police were doing what they had to do to be able to install that government.
Camilla, we have to stop here, but thank you. That fantastic reporting. I really appreciate it. The voice that you guys were listening to is Camilla Escalante. She's a TV producer and presenter at Telesur English, who also works for Keshwan News. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from the divided states of America, precipitously perched at the edge of this resilient and exploited globe. Welcome to your context lens for the American perspective. In the left and only corner this morning, I am your ever-vigilant, indefatigable political analyst, Jamarl Thomas. And typically, in the middle corner somewhere, we would have the one and only, the indispensable quantity of this team, Shane Stranahan. And you guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Let's get to the headlines. In the news. And by the way, great reporting from Camilla. She is great at her job, and I appreciate her for helping me out with that story. In COVID news, the New York Times is reporting at least 955 new coronavirus deaths and 77,718 new cases were reported in the United States on April 1st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 65,574 cases per day, an increase of 20% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Friday morning, more than 30,562,800 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus, and 553,000 have died. These numbers are astonishing. Per Washington Post, quote, British-Swedish pharmaceutical giant AstraZeneca faced fresh challenges to its coronavirus vaccine as Britain's medicines regulator said Thursday that it found 30 cases of a rare blood clot event following the shot's use. Australia announced that it was investigating a possible link between the vaccine and clotting in a man who was recently immunized. The European Union's drug regulator and the World Health Organization have both vouched for the safety of the vaccine jointly produced by Oxford University and AstraZeneca. In recent weeks, amid growing concerns that it may have caused perhaps dozens of rare blood clot disorders in Europe out of tens of millions of administered doses. 30 cases out of tens of millions of administered doses. I still say they're not wrong for investigating it. Meaning, in their investigation, they need to figure out what is causing it. Imagine for the moment they ignore the blood clots. And imagine for the moment that there is some link, there is some commonality among the various cases of the people who got that blood clot. Meaning there may be some people who can't take that vaccine but can take one of the others. And it will behoove them to know who those people are. Now, I get that there are tens of millions of people that were taking the dose without any consequence. And you may have a lot of people that say, hey, we shouldn't care about the 30 people that had a consequence from it. But I'm saying that is insane. You should, on some level, have some level of concern about what could be some kind of weird effect in the body with that vaccine of that type of brand, even if it's only 30. I don't think there's anything wrong with testing it. By the same token, you also have the problem, however, that you've just torched the vaccine when you do so. Meaning the moment that you say we're going to do scientific inquiry to figure out whether or not there's something wrong with this because there have been a blood clot disorder, you're going to have a lot of people, a certain percentage, that were already somewhat skeptical of the vaccine that are all of a sudden going to be that much more so. They may be looking for one of the other items, but you've crippled AstraZeneca's vaccine in doing so. So we'll see. I mean, if you look at Europe, Europe has been taking a hit, and they have not necessarily been doing all that well in managing and distributing their vaccines. Florida Republican Representative Matt Gaetz is being investigated by the Justice Department over sex trafficking allegations. Gaetz has denied the allegations, saying, quote, "No part in the allegations against me are true," unquote. On Tuesday, Gaetz claimed that he was the victim of an extortion plot which the FBI is investigating separately. Multiple sources have confirmed to CNN that Gaetz made a name for himself in Congress by bragging about his sexual escapades with women to his colleagues. Perhaps people with knowledge of the Gaetz actions, including two people who were directly shown the material, they said Gaetz displayed the images of women on his phone and talked about having sex with them, including while on the House floor. According to one source, one of Gaetz' videos showed a video of an unfortunate woman with a hula hoop. A source noted it was a point of pride for Gaetz. I mean, if you're showing it on the House floor, I suppose it is a point of pride for Gaetz. But yeah, those are serious charges on both sides, whether he's being held up for extortion or whether or not he's involved in some kind of sex trafficking. Both of those are bad. And the wild part is that with the sex trafficking stuff, his horn dogness comes into play. Meaning, I don't know exactly what they're referring to with the sex trafficking allegations. But if they're using that, and then within the same article they're talking about him displaying images, it's possible that the images that he was displaying were of the people or the women he was sex trafficking. That's why the story comes in concert with one another. That's the connection between the two. But it's unclear. They're investigating. So right now they're just allegations. The fourth day of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin's murder trial resumed hearing testimonies on Thursday, including an emotional account from Courtney Ross, Floyd's girlfriend, on the couple's past struggles with drug addiction. Chauvin's former supervisor testified that he should have stopped using force after Floyd was handcuffed to the ground, and Minneapolis paramedic Derek Smith testified that when he arrived on the scene, Floyd had already appeared to be dead. Real talk. Floyd appeared to be dead 3 or 4 minutes after Chauvin's knee was on his throat, and there was an X amount of time where he just appeared to be dead, while Chauvin didn't seem to want to move. I don't get the unempathy. And maybe it's one of those things where when you're a cop, you get keyed up. How dare you resist my authority? In which case, anything now is permissible because a person resisted your authority. I don't know. I do know that if you are given that much authority, then there should be a hefty amount of responsibility that goes along with that authority, not less. And if you're going to use it to basically flagrantly kill a man in broad daylight in front of all sorts of cameras, and to do so as if you're the most peaceful, docile thing in the world while your knee is on a man's throat, then yeah, you should be prosecuted and you should be put in a cage for that. And I understand that most cops get away with stuff like this, 99% to be exact. But he shouldn't. He shouldn't. And by the way, the drugs don't matter. I don't care if he was on drugs. They don't matter one iota. What matters is that he was restrained. He was put in a position where he couldn't breathe. And Chauvin, who was in a position of authority, took his life while being in a position of authority. On Wednesday evening, 1 person was injured and 4 people were killed, including a 9-year-old boy in a mass shooting at Orange Office Complex. This was in California. Authorities said the shooting took place inside a real estate and manufactured home business, Unified Homes, and that the gunman and victims were connected through business and personal ties. Officers fired through a locked gate, wounding the gunman. 2 officers fired their weapons. Both were wearing body cameras. Few details were immediately available about the motive for the shooting or details about the victims. I swear, we're getting a mass shooting pretty much every day. After failing to define Biden's $1.9 trillion COVID relief package, top Republican aides are telling Axios they learned their lesson. Did you now? What did you learn? Their game plan this time around is to try to convince voters that the infrastructure legislation is made of a wish list for progressives that is a, quote, roads and bridges, unquote, measures. Axios is reporting that a new memo from House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy says, quote, Biden's so-called infrastructure plan spends less than 6% to repair bridges, highways, and roads. The rest is a kitchen sink of wasteful progressive demands, unquote. Axios is also reporting that several Republican offices have also been circulating Wall Street Journal editorial highlighting this passage, quote, first came $1.9 trillion in social spending under the cover of COVID-19, and now comes $2.3 trillion more for climate and political spending dressed as infrastructure. Mr. Biden has proven to be the perfect political front for Warren and Sanders' agenda. I wish he was. Lord knows I wish he was. But that is not the case. This is a, if you want to call it a moderate's plan of getting the country back in order, if you want to call it that. It is just sad and unfortunate that what you have as a Republican Party is trying to convince people that this is wasteful spending, as opposed to coming up with something of your own. Instead of coming up with something on your own, you're castigating this particular plan. 550,000 people have dropped dead. Do you get that? Do you understand? Do you get the gravity of what that means? 553,000 people are no longer on this earth over the past year as a result of malfeasance of this government. And you're going to turn around and say that the infrastructure plan is too much. The stimulus plan is too much. I would argue that those things are not enough. And if you're putting this in the context of, let's say, an FDR when he was dealing with the Great Depression doesn't even come close to this, even though that is the thing in our head that gives us some kind of context of size and magnitude. And yet, FDR acted as if we were under an alien invasion, using all the powers that he could muster from his ability of rhetoric and speaking extemporaneously, using all the powers in his body to get across what needed to be done. He's trying to rescue the country and pull it from the brink. Compare that with Biden. Their argument is basically this is the most progressive legislation in 50 years, 60 years. But that's not really saying much. That's like saying a tall little person. That tall little person is the tallest little person in the history of little people at a resounding height of 3 feet 2 inches. Good luck with your plan at castigating that. I don't think that's going to work. I think the public is perfectly on board for an infrastructure plan. I think the public was on board for giving them money, giving them cash, giving them assistance in regards to the relief package. And whatever Biden comes up with next, I would imagine, if it's something that he's giving back or investing into the public, they would probably be on board for that also. The last thing that I saw last night was Biden pushing his, the education secretary to look over his powers at getting rid of student loan debt. Good. The $15 an hour minimum wage was a failure. The least you could do is that. So we'll see. U.S. Senator Chris Murphy and Representative Ro Khanna, both Democrats, addressed the stalemate between the United States and Iran regarding the return to the 2015 nuclear agreement and urged the administration to, quote, to be open and willing to take several steps back to the deal, unquote. Speaking on Wednesday on a webinar hosted by the National Iranian American Council, Murphy said that he is writing a letter with Senator Tim Kaine that would, quote, make clear that there is a sizable constituency in the United States Senate for this compliance approach. Quote, maximum pressure was a miserable 100% failure, Murphy said. And so, as we get ready to re-enter the JCPOA, it is important to remind the proponents or the opponents of the agreement that their arguments have been tested. Their argument has failed. Now is the work to get back to the agreement as quickly as possible. The United States was the first to leave, and so the United States shouldn't be wary of taking steps back to the agreement. There is no weakness in the United States admitting that. But for our non-compliance, the JCPOA will still likely be alive and well today. And so, in both private and public, I have counseled the administration to adopt a compliance for compliance. I love that. He makes the point that it's not an act of weakness because he knows that the way Biden is going to be castigated as being weak. The moment that Biden tries to step back to the deal, because you must understand the problem is one of how does Biden save face? That's the issue. How do you get back to the deal without Republicans screaming, he's weak, he's weak? Think back to Obama for the moment. What happened with Obama? When Obama tried to make deals with Iran and sign the JCPOA, if I'm not mistaken, he gave them X amount of money that he owed them. What did Republicans say? Obama just gave the Iranians a bunch of money. He gave them a bunch of money. They attacked him as being weak, as being giving away money to the Iranians, and people who aren't necessarily paying attention to politics all that closely may look at that with a raised eyebrow. I don't think Biden wants to get hit with that. I think ultimately his issue is, I don't want to get castigated as weak on Iran. And so going back to the deal by himself, he's going to get hit for it. He doesn't want to get hit for it. The catch is Iran is not going to give him a free pass on that. You've upped sanctions. You've murdered their statesmen. And on top of that, they stayed with that deal for a year. Even though Europe didn't back them like talking about, and the United States went entirely belligerent. Yes, you should go back to the deal. Yes, it is in the best interest to go back to the deal. And yes, you're going to look bad doing so. But just like you said, it is not an issue of weakness to go back to the deal, even though that is exactly the way it's going to be castigated. Right now, Biden is looking for a way to save face, and I got to be honest, I'm not quite sure what that method will be. Those are your headlines. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with the one and only Margaret Kimberly.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. But joining us, one of my favorite guests, actually, is Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly is... Oh, there we are. Yeah. Joining us is Margaret Kimberly. Margaret Kimberly is senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Prejudicial, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, I apologize for that. Welcome to the show.
Hi there. Good morning.
Good morning. So, one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, initially, I wanted to talk to you about the Derek Chauvin trial. But I think I kind of want to get into another topic just from something that happened today. The mass shooting. We seem to have a lot of these. And I am very curious about your thoughts on why so many misanthropic human beings. Like, putting yourself in the headspace of an individual that walks into a building and say, I am going to take the life of X number of people, is in and of itself shocking for it to happen once. But there's a certain commonality of this that seems to take place in American society that I don't believe for one moment is just random people with mental illnesses. What do you think about this, and how do you frame this in regards to why the United States has so many mass killings as opposed to other countries? And like I said, it's gotten to the point where this comes across as almost normal.
Well, I think it starts at the top. We have a violent state, and that does give people who may be unhinged in some way, it does function as a kind of permission. So you can't separate the two. You can't have a country that claims a right to invade other countries, to kill people, to drone strikes, foreign bases, proxy wars, all of it. You can't have a country that claims a right to do what it wants to anyone at any time and then be surprised when individuals behave the same way. You can't have a country where the police are allowed to kill. An average of 3 people every day. It's something like 1,000 Americans killed by the police every year. And most of those cases don't even make the news.
Just 1%. 1% get arrested. Yeah. Just 1%. Like, that's exactly. A shocking number. Like, when I read that stat, I mean, what is it? Like, from 2019 or 2013 to 2019, it's like nearly 1,000 killings a year with 1% prosecuted. Yep. And of that 1%, only 33% of that 1% go to jail.
So essentially, you have a group of people with a license to kill. So, and you can't have a country that's a settler colonial state. America's violent founding, genocide against the indigenous inhabitants, chattel slavery. You can't have all of those things happen and not have it become part of the ethos of the nation. And also, obviously, if you people think they have a right to have guns, and this, Second Amendment right to bear arms was not something beneficial to most people. It was to have militias so that the indigenous population and the enslaved population could be under physical control. And then you have this very cynical I think, manipulation of that already problematic idea so that millions of people think they need to have guns. And then you have a problem, I think, of a society that's in a state of collapse, economic, ecological collapse. And I think that means that the norms collapse. So people who might otherwise not think they have a right to kill people, I believe this is impacting people in a very personal way. So someone who has issues of some kind is then sort of pushed over the edge. So, and it's not just guns. I was just thinking about the mass shootings, the bombings. A couple of years ago, a young man in, I believe it was Austin, Texas, was sending people mail bombs and killing people. He was on the verge of being captured and blew himself up. The Las Vegas shooter, the guy who blew up an entire block in Nashville, Tennessee on Christmas Day last year. So I think these behaviors are becoming normalized. And I also believe the fact that this country is has no generosity towards its citizens. I think that encourages people who may have these inclinations also.
I think that creates a certain degree of stress. I agree with that.
Yes, it does.
But if you look at, And we know too that sociologically, if you're looking at like poverty and crime becomes rational, right? And so like if the person has a house, a car, a dog, their living standard is relatively stable, they enjoy their job, and the job is pretty much stable, it would be weird for that guy to sell meth. It wouldn't even make sense. Like you wouldn't get anything out of it. But if you change those variables a bit and you make it where that person is desperate and that person has bills that that person needs to pay, then meth becomes maybe a little bit more reasonable. Like it really does. Environment does, that's extreme, of course, but environment does affect behavior. But we don't see that in, let's say, the UK. With UK also was vicious. I mean, if you look at some of the places, what they did around the world, if you talk about India, if you're talking about Kenya and Africa, the UK was vicious in regards to the way they went about their imperialistic aims. But they don't have that. I mean, even with the knife thing, it doesn't seem to rise to the level of killing that we have here. If that makes sense. I mean, like, it just seems like we're a departure from the rest of the world, at the very least, supposedly the industrialized world, on this very specific issue of people with guns that are willing to use those guns.
Well, I think we have to think about all the other ways that the U.S. Differs from the countries it usually compares itself to, the democratic nations, the advanced nations, and so forth. How do we differ from them? We are the most militaristic, and these other countries sometimes join the U.S., but it's not their central reason for being like it is here. So military spending is 60% of the discretionary budget. And you can't have that. I mean, and you're in Washington, you see these ads for Raytheon and McDonnell Douglas. It's like, the business of America is warfare. And that creates two problems. It means there is not enough money for the people, and they don't want the help to be for the people. So it encourages people who have this, and who is mythologized in American culture, this lone wolf cowboy, caricature, which I think many people take seriously and embrace. So those are the differences that other countries that you're thinking of. I mean, Britain's brutality, the European nations, their brutality was committed outside of their borders against others, the other people in the global South primarily. So they had this savagery against other people, but treated their citizens, who were until recently almost all white, very differently. So I think those are some of the other things going on as well. I think it's a combination of all of those things, and it makes for a country, and it makes for a people who behave the way their state has historically.
So that gets to the whole thing of how do you fix it then? I mean, they're trying to pass gun legislation. And I remember I said when the Floyd thing first happened and people were protesting and everything else, I made the point that says going after cops in and of themselves doesn't fix the issue. Because I think the issue has a lot to do with poverty in addition to the issue of cops. How do you see that? Is that me being too focused on the economics of this? Or is there a separate and specific angle in regards to the way that cops engage? And I think the answer is yes. But if we're passing some kind of legislation to cut down on the amount of gun violence, is that possible to do? Like, is there any way to legislate yourself out of that? Or is that a cultural issue? This gets to the whole Marianne Williamson thing. I think there's something in the culture itself that is the problem. And I don't necessarily think passing a law is going to fix it. Does that make sense? Or how do you see it? I mean, is there a way to mitigate this through law?
I think there is a way to mitigate this. I think that I think it would help. It would not do away with all of it. I think a lot of people, though, would modify their behavior if they weren't allowed to stockpile weapons. It's very interesting. I read once that I can't remember the source exactly, that fewer people over time in the United States own guns, but those who do own a lot of guns. And so you have, and there's also, so there is this conflict in the culture with gun ownership being less acceptable or not acceptable depending on where you live. What part of the country do you live in? Do you live in the city? Do you live in the country? So we have this stalemate where actually I think numerically it's more people would like some sort of gun control legislation. But we have a variety of things here where, you know, states, tiny states that are rural have the same number of senators as, you know, urban states with big populations. All sorts of things that keep Americans from reaching a consensus on a lot of different issues. And this is just one of those issues. But I think we could do that by having a more generous society. I really do believe that if there was an ethos of care and concern, that there would be less violence. First of all, when you talk about just I don't know why mass shootings get more attention than if somebody shoots just one person, but we have already seen with crime, the crime rates are always highest in the poorest places. If you look at a list of the most violent cities, they're the poorest ones. So these people who argue that there's no link between poverty and violence, they're just wrong. There is. It's quite proven.
Yeah, it's clear as day. It's so clear in the research.
Yeah, so people need jobs, living wage jobs. I mean, the ability to have even living wage work is diminishing over time. It's quite terrible. These gig jobs they're not jobs actually. You're not an employee. It's like the Hunger Games. So I think as the country unravels in all of these different ways, we are going to see a rise in the number of unhinged people who act out their anger, their frustration, their sickness.
I'm curious, before we go into the break, what do you think about the argument that people on the left and the right make? And I guess this goes to both. I hear more so on the right, but I've heard people on the left make the argument too, that it is important to keep guns just in case there's a need to overthrow the government. Right-wingers said this all the time, but I've heard left-wing arguments that basically say you should not give up your guns, that part of that is the ability to be able to hold the government in check. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you think that's reasonable considering, we have airplanes and potbelly helicopters and nuclear weapons? Or how do you see it? I just asked the question in that way.
Well, I've heard that argument on the left that, for example, the takeover, the riot, whatever you called it, the Capitol or something, the left should aspire to do someday. I happen to not agree with that, but I don't think it's realistic for people on the left to think they are going to be able to use firearms to further political ends. And also I think a lot of the right wing talk about protecting themselves is BS. I think a lot of those people are violent. I think a lot of them fantasize about being able to shoot people. And so their political stance that defends their gun ownership, I have always believed is phony for many of them. And they want an excuse to be able to kill other people quite legally.
Yeah.
So I don't believe that, first of all, and I just don't think that people on the left should think that we would be able to even begin to get away with. I believe in the concept of self-defense. It was the Black Panther Party for self-defense, lest we forget, against the police or against others who would attack us. But I think the left are mistaken in thinking that is a viable option in any way.
The voice that you guys are listening to is Margaret Kimberly. She's senior columnist for and editor for Black Agenda Report, and author of Presidential Black America and the Presidents. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going to be back with Margaret Kimberly in a moment.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. By Any Means Necessary is your guide to the movement and efforts shaping the world around us, from mass incarceration.
No longer am I interested in or concerned with prison reform. I am interested only in the eradication of prisons.
To the battle between police and water protectors.
It was a pretty punishing disregard for the sanctity of human life, that unleashing water cannons on peaceful, prayerful water protectors.
From efforts to protect the environment.
The climate movement is ready to, with plenty of opposition research and force and strength, along with, the right of both science and morality, to fight them on this.
To the movement for Black Lives.
When I first saw the Michael Brown video, when I saw that it clearly contradicted the narrative put forth by the Ferguson Police Department and by police supporters in general, 3 words came to mind: color me shocked.
Stay tuned to By Any Means Necessary, 5 days a week here on Radio Sputnik. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. I came across a phenomenal article, and I'm just going to read a part of this article before I bring in a guest. It was sad to see Cuomo hold a vaccine event at a Harlem church where preachers, politicians, and other leaders outdid one another in expressing support and ignoring what may be criminality. New York NAACP President Hazel Dukes referred to Cuomo as her son and added, for emphasis, quote, "He ain't white," unquote. Former Congressman Charles Rangel saw fit to be only slightly less embarrassing when he compared Cuomo to the plight of someone who was facing unfair treatment. Quote, "You go to your family, you go to your friends, because you know they will be with you," unquote. I'm going to bring in the author of this, Margaret Kimberly, senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America, and the Presidents. Margaret, this was a great article and a weird one, only because the idea that Cuomo could go to the black community and they're like, "You ain't white. This is our guy. He's with us." And this puts me in mind of what happened here in Richmond. We had, I can't think of the guy's name to save my life, Morsi. Yeah, Morsi. And I think he was a guy put in prison. I think he got caught doing drugs at one point. And yet the black community surrounded him, circled him, "This is our guy," etc. And so when I see this, it puts me in mind of that. Cuomo, who has thousands of deaths on his conscience at this point, and who is, 10 women that has come out saying that they've been molested or assaulted by Cuomo. And for the black community to circle him like that, yeah, you're right. This is kind of embarrassing. What on earth is going on?
Well, it's a very sad story, Jamarl. It's the worst of old school black politics. That first of all, Cuomo is still governor, and right now there are budget negotiations going on. April 1st is supposed to be the deadline. So, and to make a long story short, he still has goodies to give. And should he stay in office, he has this budget cycle. He's got another one next year. So he can still dispense patronage. And that's basically all it amounts to. And so they would circle the wagons around somebody who can give them money. I mean, some of these people are just laughable buffoons. Hazel Dukes, she always can be counted on to make the most cringeworthy statement. She's not getting any better with age, I can see. But that's what it is. Nobody wants to come out against the guy who can still give them stuff, who can give money, who can give patronage. But I want to point out something else. They don't even do it in a principled way. If they said to Cuomo, "We'll back you, but you've got to let some black people out of jail," then I could forgive them. If there was something substantive in return that helped the people, and I'm just using that as an example, I could go along with it. We've already seen, because he's on the ropes, he and the state legislature couldn't reach agreement on legalizing recreational use of marijuana. And lo and behold, Cuomo's in trouble, and suddenly there's a breakthrough. I'm not sure if he did away with it, but there are now going to be limits placed on solitary confinement in prison. Something like this could be an opportunity for the people to get some kind of help. But instead, it was just the usual. And then you had the guy from the Urban League saying, well, we're building a building and the state's giving us money. And it's just disgraceful. Cuomo, by the way, it's the sexual harassment allegations that make the news. But the other issue is nursing home deaths in COVID. People who were still infected were sent to nursing homes.
Wouldn't let them test, by the way. Wouldn't let them test. And that's the wild part.
Exactly.
He got his family members tested. Even though he wouldn't let the people in the nursing home get tested to determine whether or not they had COVID.
Yes. And he also absolved the nursing home industry of any liability, so they can't be sued. I mean, those are conflicts of interest. They are skirting legality, and those are impeachable offenses, but they don't want to go up against them. And then you had the sorry spectacle. Someone leaked, and I'm glad they did, a recording of a meeting with members of the state assembly, and you even had black members saying that he was being treated unfairly. It was like the Central Park Five. Someone compared him to Emmett Till. I mean, it is sad. I don't know. I hope we have reached the bottom in regard to what passes for black leadership. Now, there are others who have said that he should resign, but they have yet to take a strong stance on impeachment. And when they say he's not being, that he would be deprived of due process, impeachment is due process. It's a trial. So he would have representation. He could call witnesses. He could testify on his own behalf. It's just not true. But they don't want to go up against him. And they are not savvy enough, and they don't care enough, even if they're going to defend him, to extract commitments that would help their constituents.
Yeah, extract political concessions. I mean, he is on the ropes, and it's not like he's the weakest man in the world. He's still governor. I think the issue is, and you're right, it's not even as bad as the sexual harassment is. It's the deaths that sticks. I mean, if that was a family member, that would be, extremely debilitating to have to deal with. From the standpoint of the people who are dealing with Cuomo, though, I think the thing that bothers me is that across the board, you have Cuomo being condemned for his behavior. And yet, you have black folks backing him up. I mean, comparing him to Emmett Till is insulting.
Yeah.
And if that was a white person that did it, all hell would break loose. And these guys are in there doing this in secret. Do you really think it's as shallow and as callous as just trying to get political concessions for themselves? You really think it's that shallow? I mean, I don't know another reason why they would do it, to be honest.
That's it. That's all there is to it. He's still governor. He still has power, and they want him to be their friend. And that is all it amounts to. And it's very self-centered. As I said before, it's not even about the people. It's a funny thing. Every time another woman comes forward, Cuomo does. It's so funny. Next week, everybody in New York State will be eligible to be vaccinated. So every time a woman came forward, they would lower the eligibility. So it's like, okay, it doesn't matter what you do. And then it was, okay, if you're 50, you're okay. Now it's 30, and next week on April 6th, I believe it is, anybody 16 and up in the state of New York can get vaccinated.
Yeah, after a while, it's going to be babies. It's just like mother's wombs. Going to be because another woman is coming forward.
If more women come forward, we will soon find out. So he feels compelled to do more in order to fight against these charges. So this would be the perfect moment to do something substantive for people if they wanted to defend him.
What happened to black politics? Because this is embarrassing. I get aggravated a lot with black politics because my impression is that to vote for a party to the tune of like 90% and to yet end up with no power is how, like, it's like, oh, like, how does that happen? And part of that, I like, you guys use the term black leadership class. There's that aspect of it where you have a lot of people who are basically sheepdogging and saying, hey, don't pay attention to, you know, the healthcare and the education, the things that will dramatically affect the people at the bottom of the income scale. Be basically you guys, no. Pay attention to, I don't know, whatever Joe Biden is doing right now. Like, it's diverting attention away from the issues that would have a dramatic effect on the lower end, or let's say that group, and diverting attention to something else. And so when Biden is running, instead of having the contingent of African Americans saying, we need to pay off school loans, and if you want our vote, you got to do that. Instead, you get backing Biden, terrified of Republicans. And that dynamic plays out year after year after year without anybody doing anything or saying anything about the fact that the dynamic exists.
Oh, absolutely. It's, well, you know, black politics, we're, you know, coming from a position of weakness, not having people who are interested in the people, not having people who are out for themselves, and having a constituency that is not as active as it needs to be, so that they know they can't get away with doing things like this and stay in office. This is the only group of people. I mean, it tells you the weakness of the black population. They're the only ones standing up and defending Cuomo. Now, polls show he still has like a 50-50 approval rating.
Really?
Decent. Yeah, he does. So it's not, it's, you know, can he get elected again? I don't know. It seems that, you know, Schumer asked him to resign, which is an indication that rich people are bailing on, he's raised, you have to raise, in order to run for governor of the state of New York, you have to be able to raise $30 million in order to have a viable campaign. Are those people going to back him? Probably not. They don't want to back a loser. They don't want to back someone where there's any controversy. So I think he's probably not going to. He wants to run out the clock, so he just doesn't run for a fourth term.
Yeah. Wow.
And they will. The big money people will find somebody else to back. That's what I think will happen.
He wanted to outdo his dad, but it doesn't look like he's going to, because this looks like it's going to be his last term. That's if he makes it out in general without being impeached. Margaret, thank you for coming on the show. I always appreciate these conversations. The voice that you guys were listening to, Margaret Kimberly. She's senior columnist and editor for Black Agenda Report and author of Presidential, Black America and the Presidents. You can follow Margaret on Twitter at Freedom Ride Blog and find her work on blackagendareport.com. An article that I referenced was called Freedom Rider, Andrew Cuomo and the Black Political Class. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. I came across a story yesterday showing that Russian and Ukrainian troops were mobilizing along the border. And the first person I thought about was Mark Sloboda. Because basically any kind of conflict or any kind of back and forth between the two countries is going to put a question to Joe Biden about whether or not he's going to get further instigated in the country. If you remember, Joe Biden was basically viceroy of the Ukraine. And if you also remember, Donald Trump was basically pushed to give him weapons to the Ukraine, something that even Obama wouldn't do. Joining us to have this conversation is Mark Sloboda. Mark Sloboda is an international relations and security analyst. Mark, thank you for joining me on short notice.
Jamarl, Shane, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on Fault Lines.
Oh, thank you, and it's always a pleasure to have you. So I came across this, and I thought to myself, well, this seems like a big deal. And my second question immediately came to my mind was, what is Biden going to do? Like, if this conflict escalates, how does the U.S. instigate itself into this conflict? Meaning, how does the U.S. make a presence in this? And will Biden make a presence in this? Especially after all the attacks against Donald Trump, you would imagine that Democrats will push him to do so, especially to push back against what they consider to be quote-unquote Russian aggression. Democrats have become howler monkeys on this thing, and I find this to be very dangerous from the standpoint of the way they behave. So what are your thoughts? What is going on first and foremost with the troops mobilizing along the border?
Okay, so first of all, there has been an ongoing, somewhat frozen civil conflict in Ukraine for some 7 years now. Since the openly West-backed putsch, which overthrew the democratically elected government of Viktor Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014. Eastern Ukraine never accepted the overthrow of the government, and the new regime that took power with the support of the West in Kiev began a military conflict to try to subjugate them to their seizure of power. It's been ongoing since then. It's been relatively frozen, but annual flare-ups, artillery fire, small movements have been normal. But this is somewhat larger in scale, I think, right now for a number of reasons. And for those who have been paying attention, and by paying attention, I don't mean the Western mainstream media, but I and many others have been warning for a month now. My first post on this was on March 5th, that the Kiev regime was moving large amounts of military equipment east to the de facto border with Donbass, with the Donbass republics. And they have been sending tanks, they have been sending conscripts, they have been sending artillery, even ballistic missiles have been reported moving on trains towards the front line of the conflict. And I think there are several reasons this time why it may be more than an annual flare-up in violence. There is an continuing economic and pandemic crisis in Ukraine. The comedian turned president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has not been able to secure a source of Western vaccines for his country. It turns out that at the end of the day, Ukrainians are really low on the Western priority list. There's been, not a good response from the Ukrainian health system towards responding to the crisis. And the regime in Kiev has refused to accept the Sputnik vaccine, the Russian vaccine, because they say it's a weapon of warfare and it will get inside our minds and so on. It would destroy our values. Ridiculous stuff about that. The same kind of stuff you heard about during the Cold War, kind of better dead than red.
That's astonishing. That's hysterical, by the way.
Yeah, sorry. It is. It's not hysterical. I've got family.
No, I don't mean hysterical in a good way. I mean, hysterical in the sense that, like, crazy. I mean, because basically they're saying my life matters less than whatever this kind of foreign policy thing that I'm dealing with right now. I mean, that's astonishing.
It's more like your life, my citizen, matters less than my foreign policy priorities of realigning the country to the West, because Zelensky already got his vaccine, so that was televised. So it's more your lives than his life. But anyway, but there is also a constitutional crisis in the country because the president has been taking on the Constitutional Court and has recently removed the Chief Justice of the Constitutional Court, trying to push through his reforms at the bidding of the West and the IMF. There is a full-on constitutional crisis between the executive and the judicial branch in the country. There is also ongoing persecution of political representation of East Ukraine. Zelensky's approval rating in the country has dropped from some 75% just a couple years ago when he was elected to around 30% now. And the approval rating of the Eastern Ukrainian opposition bloc Platform for Life has increased, and by some accounts, 7 years after the Maidan, it is now the most popular political party in the country. So Zelensky has shut down media representing Eastern Ukraine. 3 media outlets, TV outlets, have already been shut down. 8 more have been scheduled for it. And enacted at various levels. And now he's going after the leader of the opposition party for politicized charges of treason. So there's a full-on war against the so-called pro-Russian opposition, which really isn't pro-Russian. It's more Eastern Ukrainian and not rabidly anti-Russian, right, which is enough to qualify as pro-Russian. So there's a lot of political, economic, a lot of problems going on in the country. Plus, the Ukrainian government in Kiev is facing the possibility of Nord Stream 2 pipeline coming online in the next year because it is some 95% complete. And all the efforts by the U.S. so far to sanction Russian companies, European companies, to threaten Germany have failed. The regime in Kiev considers that pipeline coming online to be an existential threat to them because that will reduce the leverage they hold over Moscow as a gas transit country because gas will no longer flow through their and Polish pipelines, but under the Baltic Sea to Germany instead. And they also collect transit fees from that at a cost to both Russia and German energy consumers. That is a not insignificant part of the rather precarious Ukrainian budget. So they don't want to lose that subsidization of their economy. The Poles don't as well, it must be said.
They can't go to war over that. Or can they?
Yes, I believe they can. And I believe that what they are attempting is a small – I don't believe that they can take Donbass back by force. I don't even believe they want it back at this point because to integrate millions of Eastern Ukrainians who do not support what has happened in Kiev since 2014 back into the political system would be very, very difficult for them. And it might just swing back the political balance in the country the way the polls are looking right now. They don't want that. I think that they want a renewed conflict that would force Russia to intervene overtly and directly at some point. And they will use that as political hay and leverage to try to force Germany to shut down that pipeline. And I believe that that is what is actually going on here. But all the Western mainstream media papers will ignore all of this, all these troop movements from Ukraine that have been going on for a month. And that now that Russia is responding and has built up a rather modest, I mean, when the New York Times says 4,000 troops, all right, 4,000 troops is not an invasion force, right? It's actually just a small addition to the troops that are normally present on Russia's western border. It is not enough for an invasion force, even of Ukraine, by far, not of Ukraine today. This type of hysteria completely ignores what has been happening in Ukraine because they simply can't admit that, right? Russia is always at fault when it comes to this. The Russia's buildup of forces is simply responsive, and it's meant to warn Kiev not to renew hostilities against Donbass, and if they do, that they will pay a price. First, simply by increasing support to Donbass, but if it becomes necessary, Russia could potentially directly military intervene. But that's probably what Kiev actually wants.
Well,
although,
let me ask you this: are they doing this on some level because they know they have coverage from the U.S.? Meaning, like,
Oh yeah,
'cause Biden is a wild card. Well, I don't know if he's a wild card, but at the very least, he's probably far more interventionist than, let's say, a Trump would be.
Yeah.
Does Biden give
I
him
don't
political
believe that
cover?
there's any. Yeah, but see, I think Biden wants this to happen. The Biden administration wants this to happen because they want Nord Stream 2 pipeline shut down, not because they want to intervene military directly against Russia in a civil conflict in Ukraine. I don't think anyone wants or plans for that to happen at this point. There is always the possibility of events and misunderstandings and escalations and political tensions pushing that to happen, right? That is always the worst case scenario, and it should never be discounted as impossible. But I don't think that's likely at this point. I think this is more a limited conflict meant to ensure kind of buttress Zelensky's political domestic support at home when it's down to some 30%, but also more importantly to be used by Ukraine and the U.S. To try to force Germany to kill Nord Stream 2, practically on the eve of its completion.
The voice that you guys were listening to is Mark Sloboda, International Relations and Security Analyst. You can follow Mark on Twitter at Sloboda1 and find him on Facebook at facebook.com/Gramsci. Mark, thank you for joining us. All right, guys, we're going to end it. Today, I want to send a shout out to the engineers, Andre, our producer, our new producer, actually. And, of course, Shane, who with his bro right now. So I hope you have a good time with your bro. And we will see you on Monday. I want you guys to stay safe. Don't hurt nobody. And have a good one. Thanks. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Another one in the record books. We had a big show today. And it ran it alone. So, as you guys know, we were having, we had a big show today. Shane wasn't here, so I went on and just dropped somebody at the very end, Sloboda, when I came across the issue of troop movements, because that's actually a pretty big deal. If these guys are planning some kind of military offensive, that military offensive will have consequences in the United States, as Joe Biden is going to be positioned with the question of what do you do? What do you do? And it's very possible that Joe Biden has already even communicated with the Ukraine dealing with this issue before those troops even moved. In fact, I would argue that he probably did. It's possible that they take action separate and distinct from the United States, but I strongly suspect that what they know is that the U.S. is probably going to get involved in something like that. And I wouldn't be shocked in the least if a phone call was made to one puff of smoke, inert element, Joe Biden, to get his blessing. Kiss the ring. All right, I'm going to end this. What's happening? Yeah, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like. I'm going to say share. I'm going to say subscribe. And I want to thank all of you guys for joining me. And I will see you a little bit later. Thanks all. Bye-bye.